100 of the greatest dishes in Black American cooking were never printed in any cookbook. They passed through generations of African American kitchens by nothing but memory, a pinch of this, a handful of that, and the steady hands of someone who learned by standing next to the stove. And most of it was never written down in a way anyone could follow. It moved through watching, through tasting, through years of standing close enough to catch every detail. Some of those dishes are still on tables today. Others quietly disappeared when the person who made them was gone. This is 100 African American recipes that deserve to be remembered, remade, and passed along to the next generation. Number 17, candied yams. Sweet, glossy, and dark with brown sugar, candied yams were the dish that made a holiday plate feel like a celebration. They are sweet potatoes, slow cooked under a thick glaze of butter, brown sugar, and warm spice until the edges go syrupy and the whole pan shines. The name is a thread back to West Africa, where enslaved cooks recognized the sweet potato as kin to the yams of home and cooked it the way they remembered. As the 1960s brought new attention to what families ate, the sheer amount of sugar in dishes like candied yams drew quiet caution from nutrition writers worried about Southern cooking. Home economists sometimes suggested cutting the sugar down by half. The cooks smiled and kept the glaze deep because this was not everyday food. It was Sunday and Thanksgiving on a fork. They counted the spoonfuls of sugar, but the family counted the smiles. Number 19, rice pilau perlu. A heavy cast iron Dutch oven on a wood stove in a kitchen on St. Helena Island, July of 1885. A Gullah cook is rendering smoked sausage, and the fat is filling the room like a second weather. Onion, celery, bell pepper hit the grease, and the Trinity wakes up. Long grain Carolina gold rice goes in dry and is stirred until each kernel shines. Then chicken stock, then a whole hen quartered, then the lid. She doesn't lift it for 1 hour. The dish is called perlu, sometimes perlu, pilau. It is the West African idea of one-pot rice cookery brought across the water from Senegal, Guinea-Bissau, the Gambia, and Sierra Leone and rebuilt in a kitchen on a sea island that didn't have running water. The rice itself is the story. The Mande, Wolof, and Mende speakers who were stolen from the Rice Coast were chosen for this work. Charleston rice planters by 1720 were telling slave traders by name what region they wanted. A skilled rice grower from Sierra Leone could be sold for double the price of an unskilled captive. The crop those people built turned the Carolina Lowcountry into the wealthiest port in colonial America. The cooks pounded the rice in cypress mortars to remove the hulls, winnowed it in sweetgrass fanner baskets shaped exactly like the ones still woven in Senegal, then cooked it with whatever protein was at hand: chicken, shrimp, fish, conch, oxtail, smoked turkey neck, salt pork. What was lost? The names of the women who pounded, the count of the dead, the original pots, the original villages. What was preserved? The rhythm of the pestle, the shape of the basket, the ratio of liquid to grain, the discipline of the closed lid. A perlu cooked in Beaufort in 1885 was an unsigned contract between a kitchen and an ocean. Both sides knew the terms. Your fork is the witness. Number 16, ash cake. Before there were ovens in most rural homes, there was fire. Ash cake was cornmeal dough shaped by hand, wrapped in dampened cabbage leaves or corn husks, and buried directly in the hot ashes of a hearth fire. It baked slowly from all sides. When it was pulled out and the leaves peeled away, the outside was dark and smoky, and the inside was dense and steaming. The method was ancient. Variations of it appear in cooking traditions across West Africa, the Caribbean, and the American South. The oldest plantation records mention ash cake as the primary bread of enslaved people before the 1830s. It required no pan, no oven, no fuel beyond the fire already burning for warmth. When cast iron became widely available after the Civil War, ash cake disappeared almost overnight. Number 12, tomato pie, a deep dish, pie crust filled with thick slices of ripe summer tomato, layered with salt, pepper, fresh basil, if the garden had it, and topped with a mixture of mayonnaise and sharp cheddar cheese, then baked until the top bubbled and browned. Black families in Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia made this every July and August when tomatoes came in faster than anyone could eat them. It was a way to celebrate the garden without turning on every burner. One pie fed a table. Tomato pie never crossed into the mainstream. It stayed where it started, in the kitchens of people who grew what they ate and ate what they grew. Today, it remains one of the most underappreciated dishes in the Southern canon, hiding in plain sight at church potlucks and family reunions where nobody thinks to write it down. Number 12, collard greens with smoked turkey neck. A pile of collards came in from your garden, big leaves, dark and crinkled, washed in 3 changes of cold water until the grit was gone. You stripped each leaf off its tough center stem, stacked them, rolled them, and cut them into thin ribbons like green confetti. A smoked turkey neck went into a heavy pot with water, garlic, a chopped onion, and a tablespoon of bacon grease. It simmered for an hour to make a broth. The greens went in next and cooked for another hour and a half until they collapsed into a tender, dark green tangle and your broth turned almost black. A splash of vinegar at the end, a dash of red pepper flakes, a bowl with the pot liquor and cornbread to sop it up. In Gullah Geechee culture, greens on your New Year table mean money in the coming year. Even families that ate greens every week of their lives still made a fresh pot on January 1st. The symbolism mattered as much as the flavor. Number 11, deviled eggs. A plate of deviled eggs at a black church supper was a quiet show of skill. Every woman in the congregation made them, and every woman made them differently. The eggs were boiled, halved, and the yolks mashed with mustard, a little pickle relish, salt, pepper, and enough mayonnaise to hold it together. The filling was spooned or piped back into the whites and dusted with paprika. The dish cost almost nothing. Eggs came from backyard hens. Mustard came from a jar that lasted months. Yet the result looked deliberate and refined, the kind of food that suggested effort even when there was barely any. The paprika on top was purely decorative. It added no flavor anyone could taste, but a plate of deviled eggs without it looked unfinished, and no churchwoman would bring an unfinished plate to the fellowship table. Here is the uncomfortable truth that no history book puts on the cover. During the Great Depression, the federal relief programs that kept white families from starving were systematically denied to black families across the South. The New Deal employment programs hired white workers first. Agricultural subsidies went to white landowners who then evicted their black sharecroppers. Surplus food distribution centers were segregated, and in many counties, black families were turned away entirely. The church kitchen was not a quaint tradition. It was an emergency response to a government that had decided quietly and bureaucratically that black hunger was not a priority. Every casserole, every pot of peas, every cake baked from the cheapest ingredients available was an act of organized resistance. The women who cooked did not call it that. They called it Sunday dinner, but the effect was the same. Number 9, neck bones and lima, beans. The neck was the cheapest cut at the meat counter, little more than bone and the sweet scraps clinging to it, and Big Mama knew it was a treasure. She simmered the neck bones for hours until the meat surrendered, then dropped in lima beans, to drink up all that smoky, marrow-rich liquor. What came out was a thick, sticking-to-your-ribs supper that cost almost nothing and fed everybody twice. It was poverty turned into plenty by patience alone. As cooks reached for boneless and quick, the humble neck got left in the cooler. A pot built on the cheapest bone in the shop became a dish folks forgot how to love. Number 17, vanilla bean ice cream. Not vanilla extract. The actual bean, split with the paring knife, seeds, scraped into the warming cream. The smell filled the kitchen for hours. This was the version that embarrassed every carton in the frozen aisle. The difference between real bean and extract was the difference between a voice and an echo. Families saved vanilla beans for this one purpose. Some kept them in a jar of sugar all year long, so the sugar itself carried the flavor before it ever touched the cream. That jar does not exist in most kitchens anymore. Here is something that gets lost in the telling. Hand-churned ice cream was not a recipe. It was a technology. The wooden bucket, the metal canister, the dasher inside, the layers of ice and rock salt packed around it. Every family owned one of these machines or knew a neighbor who did. They cost almost nothing, lasted decades, and required only ice, salt, and human labor to operate. No electricity, no moving parts that could break. The only thing they could not survive was a generation that stopped using them. When electric ice cream makers arrived, the hand crank moved to the shed. When grocery stores started selling half gallons for a few dollars, the electric maker moved to the shelf above the refrigerator. And when the women who remembered the wooden bucket passed, the knowledge of what came out of it, the textures and temperatures and timings that no instruction manual could replicate, left the world with them. What replaced it was convenient. It was not the same. Number 15, slumgullion stretch stew. Slumgullion was the word for whatever you had. In Corin's pot, that meant a cup of leftover rice, a handful of chopped onion, 2 cold pork chops, diced small, a can of tomatoes, and a dash of hot sauce. Everything simmered together for 30 minutes until the rice swelled and the whole pot smelled like Sunday. The name was a joke. The meal was serious. A laundress with 3 boarders and 22 cents in her apron pocket could feed everyone on slumgullion, and no one would walk away hungry. What I noticed reading old Harlem papers is how often the word turned up in women's columns. Slumgullion was code for stretching a paycheck to the next Friday. Generations of women did it. The best kind of cheap cooking there ever was. Cooking with potash and lye was a practice African American families used for generations, particularly in preparing hominy and nixtamalized corn. Wood ash was soaked in water to create an alkaline solution that softened dried corn kernels and removed their tough outer hulls. Health officials condemned lye as dangerous, with no place in food preparation. But food scientists now recognize this as nixtamalization, a technique that dramatically increases the nutritional value of corn by releasing bound niacin and improving protein quality. Without this treatment, communities relying heavily on corn risked pellagra, a devastating deficiency disease. African American and indigenous families who processed corn with lye were preventing nutritional disease centuries before scientists understood the chemistry. Fried chicken with red-eye gravy combined 2 Southern traditions into a breakfast dish that carried workers through long morning hours. The chicken was fried simply with salt and pepper, then removed while magic happened in the drippings. Strong black coffee was poured directly into the hot pan, sizzling and scraping up all the brown bits into a thin, bitter gravy, unlike anything else in Southern cooking. The gravy got its name from the red circle of fat floating in the center when poured, staring up like an eye. This wasn't thick or creamy, but sharp and intense, meant to be spooned over fried chicken and sopped up with biscuits alongside grits. African American households served this when the day demanded serious fuel. This breakfast tradition has nearly vanished from modern tables. Long before manwich showed up in a can in 1969, Black mothers were making sloppy joes from scratch: ground beef, tomato paste, ketchup, brown sugar, mustard, vinegar, and Worcestershire sauce cooked down until the mixture went thick and glossy, spooned onto the softest white buns you could find, 19 cents for a pack of 8. It was the kind of meal children measured in stains, sauce on wrists, on shirt fronts, pooling on the plate where you mopped it up with the last scrap of bread. Every woman had her own ratio of sweet to acid, and she guarded it like she guarded her cast iron. The canned version eventually won the convenience war, but it never touched the original. The women who made it from memory never switched over, and when they were gone, their ratios vanished with them. Nobody wrote it down. That was always the problem with the best things from those kitchens. They lived in hands, not on paper. Ham hocks and black-eyed peas was New Year's Day tradition, and weeknight sustenance rolled into one pot. The smoked hocks simmered for hours, releasing their salty, smoky essence into dried peas that absorbed every bit of flavor. Onions, garlic, and bay leaves joined the pot, while some cooks added vinegar or hot sauce for brightness. The peas turned creamy while holding their shape, swimming in pot liquor rich enough to be a meal on its own. Served over rice with cornbread for sopping, this dish promised luck when eaten on New Year's, but delivered satisfaction any day. Ham hocks cost almost nothing, yet flavored entire pots of food. This dish carried superstition and survival in equal measure, connecting families to traditions that stretch back generations. Number 11, fried catfish. Picture a Friday evening in a southern kitchen, the cast iron heavy with grease and a paper sack of cornmeal waiting on the counter, because this was the dish that turned the end of a long week into a celebration. You take the catfish, fresh from a muddy river bottom or a roadside stand, and you soak it in buttermilk, then drag each piece through seasoned cornmeal until it is coated rough and white. The grease has to be hot enough that the fish hits the surface and roars, and you stand over it and listen, because the sound tells you when the crust is turning gold and the edges are going lacy and crisp. The smell of it fills the whole house and pulls everyone toward the table before you even call them. Catfish was a poor table's feast, a fish that fed itself off the bottom of rivers and ponds where nobody had to pay for it, and the cornmeal coating and the deep grease came straight out of the same rations of meal and fat that built every other soul food dish. But by the 1960s, the catfish drew official notice on two fronts at once. The bottom-feeding fish itself raised sanitation questions among the era's public health officers, who fretted about river water and the small roadside markets where it was sold, and they pressed families to handle and cook it with care. At the same time, the deep grease it was fried in landed it squarely in the path of the new, saturated fat message that swept through Southern kitchens after the American Heart Association issued its first warning. County nutrition columns of the day nudged readers toward baking or broiling fish instead of frying it. You can imagine a grandmother reading that and shaking her head, because a baked catfish was not Friday supper. It was a sad imitation of it. The skillet stayed hot and the family gathered around the platter the way they always had. They warned about the grease in the river, and the table answered with an empty plate. Number 16, sour orange marinade. A bitter orange split open over a wooden bowl. The juice squeezed onto skinned mullet or whiting fillets. Salt, black pepper, a smashed clove of garlic, a curl of onion. The fish sat in the marinade for 2 hours, then went on a hot pan with a strip of fatback. Senegambian cooks used tamarind, lime, and the sour African plum to break down strong fish before cooking. On the Carolina coast, the bitter orange tree, brought up from Florida by Spanish sailors in the 1600s, did the same job. Low country African American cooks took the substitute and kept the principle. The fish at the Sunday table tasted like a coast that had been left behind without losing its grammar. The bitter orange tree still grows wild on a few back lots in Bluffton, the same trees a Sunday cook in 1880 stripped on her walk home from church. You're cooking a sentence in a language that crossed the ocean before your name did. Molasses pulled candy. Sugar was expensive, molasses was not. The candy recipe that appeared most often in the old cookbooks was molasses pulled candy. Molasses boiled with a little vinegar and butter until it reached the hard, cracked stage, then pulled by hand while it cooled. Pulling was the work. Two people stood across from each other, stretching the hot rope of candy until it turned from dark brown to pale gold. Children watched from the kitchen table. The pulling changed the texture from sticky to brittle, and when it cooled enough, it was cut into small pieces and wrapped in wax paper. The kitchen smelled like burnt sugar for the rest of the night. It was the only candy most rural Black children ever tasted outside of Christmas, and most of them remember the pulling more than the eating. Number 12, Jerusalem artichoke relish. The Jerusalem artichoke is not an artichoke and has nothing to do with Jerusalem. It is a sunflower root native to this continent, and it grew wild across the South in thick patches along creek beds and open fields. Black families in rural Mississippi and Alabama dug them up in autumn and turned them into relish, peeled, chopped fine, mixed with onion and green peppers, packed in vinegar and sugar, and canned in mason jars. The relish was sharp and crunchy, served alongside roasted meat or on top of field peas. The recipes appeared in handwritten community cookbooks from small Black churches in the Delta, passed around at church suppers, and preserved in collections that most libraries never cataloged. The tubers are still growing wild today. Nobody picks them anymore. Number 15, pear preserves. Not the soft pears from the supermarket, the small, hard, sandy pears that grew in nearly every Black family's yard across the rural South. They were called sand pears or Kiefer pears, and eating them raw was a chore, but cooked down with sugar and a little lemon juice, they turned translucent and amber and held their shape in the jar. Pear preserves went on biscuits, on pancakes, on a spoon, straight from the jar. Canning day was an all-day affair, usually led by the oldest woman in the house, and the jars lined the pantry shelf like currency. When the pear trees were cut down to make room for new construction, the preserves disappeared too. Here is the uncomfortable truth the grocery industry does not advertise. African American cooking was never a cuisine of limitation. It was a cuisine of intelligence. The recipes on this list did not come from people who lacked options and stumbled into flavor by accident. They came from cooks who understood fat, acid, salt, smoke, and time at a level that formal culinary training now charges thousands of dollars to teach. The French mother sauces get a semester. Black grandmothers learn roux by standing next to the stove at age 9, stirring until the flour turned the right shade of brown and getting popped on the hand if they stopped too soon. That transfer of knowledge was more rigorous than most people understand. It produced cooks who could walk into a kitchen with almost nothing and walk out with something people still talk about decades later. The erasure was never about the quality of the food. It was about who made it. And until that fact is said plainly, no amount of celebrity chef, tributes, or soul food revival festivals will fix what was broken. The knowledge was stolen first, then it was repackaged, then the original cooks were forgotten. That sequence is not an accident. It is a pattern, and it has been running for over 100 years. Number 18, fish stew with whiting. The whiting was small, white-fleshed, and almost free at the dock if you came at the end of the run. A man on Hilton Head in 1955 could buy a paper bag full for 50 cents. The fish were headed and cleaned, then laid into a pot with sliced onion, diced potato, a piece of salt pork, and water to cover. Some cooks added a fresh tomato in summer, some didn't. It cooked 25 minutes, no longer, until the potato was tender and the fish broke apart in soft white flakes like paper in water. Salt and black pepper at the end, a piece of cornbread on the side. The broth was thin and clean and tasted of the marsh. There was no cream, no roux. This wasn't New England chowder. This was a Sea Island stew built to feed 8 people from one cheap fish every Friday in houses from Beaufort to Brunswick. Number 18, banana pudding. Every black church supper during the Depression had a dessert table, and banana pudding sat at the center of it. The recipe was simple: vanilla wafers, sliced bananas, and a custard made from eggs, sugar, milk, and a little flour layered in a baking dish and topped with meringue browned in the oven. Bananas were cheap. By the 1930s, United Fruit had flooded American markets with Central American bananas at prices even the poorest families could afford. A bunch cost a few pennies. The wafers came from a box. The custard required nothing exotic, yet the finished dish tasted rich, creamy, and almost luxurious. Church women assembled it hours before the meal, letting the wafers soften into the custard until the layers blurred together. The meringue on top turned golden and slightly wept in the summer heat. Children fought over the corners of the dish where the custard had thickened against the glass. Number 21, roast possum with sweet potatoes. A century ago, this was a delicacy that black epicures held in genuine high regard, hard as that is to imagine today. The animal was cleaned and parboiled to render the heavy fat, then roasted in a pan ringed with sweet potatoes that drank up the drippings. As they baked, the meat came out tender and dark, the potatoes glazed and soft, and the whole thing arrived at the table as a point of pride, not a punchline. It was a celebration dish that marked a special Sunday or a homecoming. Families carried the recipe north during the Great Migration, but the city had no woods and no possums to hunt. Taste shifted, shame crept in, and a proud dish became an embarrassed silence. What was once company food is now a recipe almost nobody will admit their grandmother made. Number 19, egg custard ice cream. This was the foundation recipe, the one every other flavor built upon. 6 eggs, sometimes 8, beaten until pale, then cooked slowly with whole milk and cream over a double boiler until the mixture coated a wooden spoon. Vanilla bean, if the family could afford it, extract if they could not. The cooking required patience and a steady hand because the eggs would scramble if the heat climbed too fast. Grandmothers in every southern state made their own version of this custard, and no two tasted the same. The differences came down to how long you cooked the base, how much sugar you dared to add, whether you used all cream or stretched it with milk. Some women added a splash of bourbon to the base while it was still warm, just enough to round off the sweetness without making it a drink. Others dropped in a scraped vanilla pod and let it steep overnight before straining it out. This was the ice cream that showed up at funerals, at homecomings, at the table when the pastor came for Sunday dinner. It said, "This house has enough. This house can afford cream and eggs and time." When it sat on the table in a glass bowl with condensation running down the sides, it meant something beyond dessert. It meant abundance in a place where abundance was not guaranteed. The women who made it never called it egg custard ice cream. They just called it ice cream. Everything else was a variation. Number 8, chitlins cleaned 3 times. Chitlins are hog intestines. They arrive at your kitchen looking like nothing you would want to touch. Cleaning them takes hours. You wash them in cold water. You turn them inside out. You scrape them with a dull knife. You wash them again in vinegar water. You wash them a 3rd time in salt water, and then you boil them with onion, red pepper, and a splash of white vinegar for 3 full hours until the house smells like a slaughterhouse and the pot finally settles into something tender and tangy and impossible to forget. In 1928, Harlem, chitlins were the centerpiece of a Saturday night rent party. A plate of chitlins with hot sauce, potato salad, and a wedge of cornbread went for $1. The pianist played stride in the front room. The neighbors crowded in. Corrine would cook 10 pounds in a night, and the pot was scraped bare by 2 in the morning. But chitlins were never just food. They were a memory of what the plantation kitchens had been forced to use. The parts of the hog that the enslavers would not eat. The cuts that black women turned into something worth paying for on a 7th Avenue stoop. Every time a pot of chitlins went on the fire, it was an act of inheritance. The recipe came up from the Low Country. The cleaning technique came from a grandmother who had learned it from her own mother, who had learned it from the great aunt who arrived in Charleston Harbor with nothing. Here is the part that surprises people. Chitlins were expensive for Corrine to make, not in money, in time. She spent 6 hours cleaning and cooking what sold for $1 a plate. She did the work because it paid the rent, but she also did the work because nobody else in that building knew how. When Hazel, the 12-year-old downstairs, asked to help one Saturday night in November of 1928, Corrine handed her a dull knife and said, "You watch first." Hazel watched. For 3 years. By 1931, she was cleaning her own. That is how a kitchen tradition survives when there's nothing to write it down on. Bone broth, simmered for days, was a kitchen constant in African American homes where pots of bones and herbs stayed on the back of the stove for hours. Neck bones, ham hocks, chicken backs, and oxtails were slow cooked until marrow dissolved into rich golden liquid that became the base for soups, gravies, and rice. Modern health trends have only recently caught up to what Black grandmothers always knew. Long simmered bone broth is rich in collagen, gelatin, and amino acids, supporting gut health and joint function. The practice of saving bones and simmering them was dismissed as thrifty desperation, but scientists confirm it extracts minerals in highly bioavailable forms. What wellness brands sell for premium prices was once free in every Black kitchen. Brown paper bag fried chicken was a technique passed through generations of African American cooks who understood that perfect coating was all in the shake. Seasoned flour went into a large brown paper bag with the chicken pieces. The bag closed tight and shaken vigorously until every piece was evenly coated. The paper absorbed excess moisture while shaking ensured coating adhered without clumping in hot oil. This method was economical and practical, eliminating the need for multiple bowls and creating less mess in kitchens where space was precious. The coating fried into a crust that shattered beautifully with each bite. Children often begged to do the shaking, turning meal preparation into family activity filled with laughter. Plastic bags and dredging stations have replaced this method, but something was lost when the bag disappeared. Ground beef chili in a Black household was nothing like what showed up at a Texas cook-off. There was no argument about beans. Of course there were beans, because beans stretched the meat, and that was the whole point. You browned the beef with onion and green pepper, stirred in tomato paste, kidney beans, chili powder, cumin, and garlic, then let it simmer until the liquid thickened enough to hold the spoon upright, and you never served it in a bowl by itself. It went over white rice, always rice, because rice was 5 pounds for 60 cents, and it doubled the number of mouths a single pot could feed. Some women added a teaspoon of sugar to soften the acid, a detail you either understood or you did not. By Friday, reheated twice, the flavors fully married, that chili tasted better than it did on Wednesday. It was the kind of dish that improved with patience, the same way the women who made it had improved everything around them through patience alone. Kidney stew was a dish that required courage to try, but rewarded adventurous eaters with rich, complex flavors. Pork or beef kidneys were cleaned, carefully soaked to remove any strong taste, then sliced and browned before simmering with onions, tomatoes, and seasonings. The meat turned tender and absorbed the gravy's flavors while contributing its own mineral richness to the pot. Served over rice or with bread to soak up the sauce, kidney stew provided iron and protein at a fraction of the cost of regular meat. In the 1970s, organ meats appeared regularly on tables where stretching the grocery budget was a necessity. Grandmothers who knew how to prepare kidneys properly earned reputations for their skill, turning what others rejected into something genuinely delicious. This dish has nearly disappeared, but deserves to be remembered. Number 22, smothered pork chops. Smothering was the art of taking a tough, cheap chop and drowning it in gravy until it surrendered. The chops were browned in lard, then left to simmer low under a thick roux gravy built from the pan drippings and flour until the meat fell soft and the gravy ran rich and brown over the rice. It was a way to make a hard cut tender and a small portion feel like plenty, a survival skill passed down through hard times. When the saturated fat warnings spread in the 1960s, that lard and drippings gravy was precisely the cooking style the New Heart guidance flagged, all that rendered pork fat thickened and poured over everything on the plate. County home economists sometimes urged families to skim the fat or skip the gravy altogether. The kitchen heard the advice and kept the spoon in the skillet. They tried to thin the gravy down, but the family kept it thick. Number 23, okra soup. Pods sliced into green wheels, dropped into a pot of tomatoes and beef bone broth, simmered until the soup turned glossy and thick. Charleston grandmothers cooked it in summer when the okra came in from the kitchen garden by the bushel. The Igbo people of southeastern Nigeria called it ofe okwuru. The Bantu speakers of Central Africa called it kingombo. That second word, slurred through 3 generations of a Carolina dialect, became the word gumbo. A pot of low country okra soup in 1880 was a dictionary entry your great-grandmother could eat. She didn't need to read it. The recipe carried the language inside the spoon. The Gula cooks dried the late summer pods on strings hung from porch rafters and pulled them down through the cold months to thicken winter stews. You can still taste the Igbo word in a Beaufort kitchen on a Sunday afternoon. The soup remembers. Number 19, hoe cake. The name was literal. Before the American Revolution, enslaved field workers cooked cornmeal batter on the flat blade of a garden hoe held over an open fire. There was no kitchen, no oven, no table. There was a tool meant for digging, repurposed for cooking, because it was the only flat piece of metal within reach. The earliest written references appear in Virginia plantation records from the 1700s, where overseers noted that enslaved people baked cakes on their hoes during midday breaks. By the early 1800s, hoe cake had migrated indoors. Cast iron griddles replaced the hoe blade, and the recipe appeared in nearly every Southern cookbook published before the Civil War. But the name stuck. Hoe cake, a word that carries inside it the full history of Black cooking in America, making something nourishing out of almost nothing, using tools that were never designed for the purpose. The batter itself was the simplest thing imaginable. Cornmeal, water, a pinch of salt, cooked flat until the edges brown. Some versions added a spoonful of lard. Some added buttermilk, but the original needed nothing more than meal, water, and heat. Abraham Lincoln reportedly ate hoe cakes as a child in Kentucky. Frederick Douglass wrote about them. The dish crossed every line of class and color in the antebellum South. And then it vanished. Not because it stopped tasting good, but because the name reminded people of something the country wanted to forget. The garden hoe hanging in the shed became just a garden tool again. The cake baked on it became just cornbread, and the people who invented it became a footnote in someone else's cookbook. Number 21, sweet potato butter roll. Not a roll made with butter, a sheet of biscuit dough spread with mashed sweet potato, brown sugar, cinnamon, and a generous amount of butter, then rolled tight like a jelly roll, sliced and baked in a pan with a syrup pooling around the edges. Black families in Virginia, the Carolinas, and Tennessee made these for church bake sales and holiday tables. The syrup caramelized during baking and turned the bottom edges crisp. Most modern sweet potato recipes lean toward casseroles with marshmallows on top. The butter roll was the original, and it did not need a single marshmallow. The women who made it measured nothing. They knew the dough by feel, the filling by taste, and the oven by sound. That confidence came from making it dozens of times, and it could not be replaced by a recipe card. Here is something worth saying out loud. Every recipe on this list came from kitchens that operated on a budget most Americans today would not recognize. $1.50 fed a family of 6. Not because the food was cheap in the way fast food is cheap. It was cheap because the cook knew things. She knew which cuts the butcher would practically give away. She knew what grew in the yard without planting. She knew how to stretch one protein across 3 meals without anyone feeling shorted. That knowledge was not written down. It moved mouth to ear, hand to hand, and when the person who held it passed, the recipe often went with them. That is the real cost of what was lost. Number 15, smoked mullet. The mullet schooled in your inland creeks and could be cast netted by one person with patience. The fish was split, salted, and laid skin down on a wire rack over a smoldering fire of oak and hickory in a small backyard smokehouse. It smoked for 6 hours over very low heat until the flesh turned a deep amber and the skin pulled away clean like bark off a tree. A whole smoked mullet kept for a week in your cool pantry without refrigeration. Your grandmother on a disto would flake it onto cornbread with a slice of raw onion and call it lunch. The fish carried so much flavor that no sauce was needed. No butter, no lemon. The smoke had done the work. Mullet has fallen out of favor on most American menus. On the sea islands, it's still pulled out of the creek the same way it was 100 years ago. Number 15, oatmeal cake. This cake has nearly disappeared from the American table, but during the Depression, it was a staple of Black church bake sales. The recipe called for oats soaked in boiling water, which softened them into a thick paste that gave the cake a dense, moist texture, unlike anything made with flour alone. The topping set it apart, a broiled mixture of brown sugar, butter, coconut, and chopped pecans that bubbled and caramelized under the heat. The broiler had to be watched closely. 30 seconds too long and the coconut burned black. Oats cost almost nothing. A single cake served a dozen people and required no frosting, no decoration, and no apology. Church women who made it well were known for it the way some women were known for their singing voice. Number 12, liver pudding. Out of the Carolina Piedmont came a dish built from the parts of the hog that polite cooks pretended did not exist. The cooks simmered liver and scrap meat with onion, black pepper, and sage, ground it soft, and bound it with cornmeal until it set into a savory loaf. Sliced and fried for breakfast or spread thick on a morning biscuit, it carried a deep peppery richness no store meat has matched. It was the genius of a people who turned what the smokehouse rejected into something worth waking up for. Hog killing time made it possible, and the cold pantry kept it safe. When families stopped butchering their own pork, the liver pudding had no source and no reason. A breakfast born of thrift quietly left the table. Number 15, brown sugar ice cream. White sugar replaced with dark brown sugar, giving the cream a molasses undertone and a color like wet sand. Simpler than molasses ice cream and sweeter, with a caramel edge that clung to the roof of the mouth. This one survived longer than most because brown sugar remained cheap and available, but the hand-churned version, with its coarser texture and heavier body, disappeared when electric machines took over. The speed of the churn changes the crystal structure of the ice. A fast machine makes it smooth. A slow hand makes it dense. They are not the same dessert. Number 1, gumbo herbes, 7 greens for luck. This is the pot that changed how Harlem ate on New Year's morning for the next 40 years. Gumbo herbes is a Creole dish from New Orleans that traveled up the Mississippi and eventually north on the trains. The rule was you used an odd number of greens, 7 for a poor household, 9 for a better one, 11 for the richest block on the hill. Corrine used 7, mustard, turnip, collard, spinach, watercress, cabbage, and beet tops. She simmered them for 90 minutes with a ham hock and an onion. Then she chopped the whole mess fine, returned it to the broth, added a roux of flour and bacon fat, and let the pot thicken on the low burner for another hour. The gumbo was dark green, almost black, rich as anything she ever cooked. Every green carried a promise: mustard for wealth, collard for money, turnip for roots. 7 greens for 7 strangers you might meet in the coming year, each one a chance at a blessing. A bowl of gumbo herb on New Year's morning was a prayer you could eat. Corrine served it with rice and a wedge of cornbread to her 3 boarders and 2 visiting cousins on the 1st of January in 1929, the morning after the biggest rent party she ever threw. Every spoonful was a bet on the next 12 months. Every bite was an ancestor at the table. Eating organ meats like kidneys and hearts was a weekly occurrence in many African American homes, especially when families stretched every part of a butchered animal. Health authorities discouraged organ meat consumption for decades, warning about cholesterol and fat content. But nutritional science has reversed course, recognizing organ meats as some of the most nutrient-dense foods available. Kidneys are packed with B12 and selenium, while hearts provide concentrated coenzyme Q10, a compound modern supplements now market at premium prices. Black grandmothers who fried kidneys with onions or stewed hearts with gravy were delivering superfoods before the term existed. The very foods dismissed as poverty eating contain the exact nutrients wellness culture now celebrates. Church supper fried chicken was prepared in quantities that could feed congregations and carry reverence beyond simple cooking. Women arrived at church kitchens before dawn, seasoning dozens of chicken pieces and heating large pots of oil. Each cook brought her own seasoning blend, creating variations that attendees could identify by taste alone. The chicken was fried in batches and kept warm in foil-lined boxes, transported to fellowship halls where it anchored tables alongside potato salad and collard greens. What made church supper chicken special was the communal effort and pride each woman took in her contribution. These were collective offerings made with love for community and faith. Children remember which church mother made the best chicken. This tradition has faded as congregations shrink and catering replaces home cooking. Years before Hamburger Helper arrived on grocery shelves in December of 1970, every black mother who stretched a budget already knew the formula: ground beef, elbow macaroni, tomato sauce, and whatever cheese she could melt into it. The beef went into the skillet first, crumbled and browned with onion and garlic powder. Tomato sauce, a little water, salt, pepper, and the dry macaroni went straight in. No boiling required, because the noodles cooked right there in the sauce and absorbed all that flavor. When the pasta was tender and the liquid reduced to a thick, glossy coating, she stirred in cheddar and put the lid back on just long enough for the cheese to pool. The whole thing took 30 minutes and cost less than $1. Betty Crocker eventually boxed this concept and sold it back to the same women who invented it, and somehow that box became more famous than the hands that never needed instructions. Stuffed bell peppers with rice transformed garden vegetables into complete meals that were beautiful enough for company. Large peppers were hollowed and filled with a mixture of ground beef, rice, tomatoes, onions, and seasonings, then baked until the peppers softened and the filling bubbled. The juices from the meat mingled with the tomatoes to create a sauce that pooled in the baking dish, perfect for spooning over each serving. Some families topped theirs with cheese in the final minutes, adding richness to an already satisfying dish. In the 1970s, stuffed peppers appeared at church suppers and Sunday dinners, showing how creativity stretched a pound of meat to feed a family. The peppers came from backyard gardens in summer, making the dish nearly free when produce was abundant. This was food that honored both thrift and presentation. Number 19, neck bones. There was always more flavor than meat on a neck bone, and that was exactly the point. These knobby pork bones were sold cheap, sometimes nearly given away, and a cook would brown them and let them go low and slow with onion and a little water until the gravy turned deep and the scraps of meat slipped right off. They seasoned a pot of beans or stood alone over rice, a survival dish that fed a family on next to nothing. When the 1960s heart message took hold, neck bones drew notice on two fronts: the rendered pork fat, the new saturated fat guidance warned about, and the salt that seasoned the pot. Nutrition leaflets of the day nudged families toward leaner, lower salt cooking. The cook nodded and reached for the neck bones just the same. Officials measured the fat and the salt, and the family measured the gravy. Number 13, akara bean fritters. Black-eyed peas soaked overnight, the skins rubbed off between the palms, the peas pounded into a wet white paste with a little salt and chopped onion. The paste was scooped by spoon into hot lard and fried until the fritters puffed up golden. In Yoruba land, this is called akara. In Sierra Leone and Senegal, it travels by other names. On the Carolina coast, a version of this fritter was sold by black women out of baskets along the Charleston market alleys in the 1850s, cooked in pots set up on the curb. 2 cents a piece. They tasted of Lagos, and nobody on the buying end knew the word. The women selling them did. They walked the same alleys day after day, bouncing the basket on a headcloth the way their mothers had in Lagos. You can fry a dozen tonight, and you're opening a market that closed 170 years ago. Now, back to the list. Number 23, poke salad. The plant grew wild along fence rows and ditches across the South, and in spring, when the pantry was at its emptiest, women went out with a bucket and picked the young leaves before they turned toxic. Poke salad had to be boiled 3 separate times. The water poured off between each boil because the mature plant is poisonous. The old cookbooks were specific about this. 3 waters, no shortcuts. After the 3rd boil, the greens were fried in bacon grease with scrambled eggs. It was bitter, earthy, and free. The dish showed up in community cookbooks from East Tennessee to the Alabama Black Belt, always with the same warning about the 3 boils. Skip one and you would know it. Wild food foraging is trendy now, but for black families in the rural South, it was Tuesday. Nobody called it foraging, they called it getting by. Number 8, chicken pastry. In eastern North Carolina, this is not chicken pot pie, and it is not chicken and dumplings, though people from outside the region confuse it with both. Chicken pastry starts with a whole hen, boiled until the meat falls from the bone. The broth is rich and golden. Thin sheets of pastry dough, rolled out by hand and cut into strips or squares, are layered with the pulled chicken in a deep baking dish. The broth is poured over until it just reaches the top layer, and the whole thing is baked until the top pastry turns golden and the layers beneath go soft and silky, almost like a savory bread pudding. Black families in the coastal plain of North Carolina have made chicken pastry for generations. It appears at funerals, homecomings, and Thanksgiving tables alongside the turkey, and in some families, it outranks the turkey entirely. Every family has a version, and every family believes theirs is the right one. The pastry has to be thin enough to see through, or it is wrong. The chicken has to be a whole hen, not boneless breasts, or the broth will be weak, and the dish has to sit for 10 minutes after it comes out of the oven, or the layers will not set. There was no recipe card. The measurements lived in the hands of the woman rolling the dough, the way she felt the thickness between her fingers and knew when it was right. She did not time anything. She watched. She listened to the oven. She pulled it when the kitchen smelled a certain way. Chicken pastry does not travel well outside the families that make it because the recipe depends on feel, not measurement. When the women who made it by feel passed on, many families lost the dish entirely. Some are trying to bring it back now, working from memory, getting close, but never quite matching what their grandmother pulled from that oven. Number 7, bean. Number 19, Sapelo Island sugarcane syrup biscuits. The cane that mattered here was purple ribbon, an heirloom variety that grew thick and dark on the small island farms. By 1996, it had nearly disappeared from the South entirely, and most cooks today would tell you they've never tasted it. Cornelia Walker Bailey, the Geechee griot of Hog Hammock, fought to bring it back. She and a small group of cuisine revivalists planted purple ribbon on her farm and at Georgia Coastal Gourmet Farms in nearby Shellman Bluff. The cane was cut by hand in the cool months, crushed in a mule-driven press older than her grandfather, and boiled down for hours in a wide iron kettle over a wood fire. The syrup that came out was almost black, with a flavor halfway between molasses and burnt sugar, the way only slow fire can build. Mrs. Bailey used it in biscuits the way her mother had. The dough was simple: self-rising flour, a spoon of lard, buttermilk, salt, rolled, cut, baked hot. While they baked, she warmed purple ribbon syrup in a small saucepan with a sliver of butter. When the biscuits came out, she split each one open and poured the warm syrup directly into the steaming center. The biscuit collapsed slightly under the weight, like cloth folding. The syrup soaked into every crumb. A child on Sapelo would hold the saucer with both hands and tilt the syrup toward the lower half so nothing was wasted. Mrs. Bailey passed in 2017. The cane she rescued still grows on her farm. The biscuits are still served at the small store on the island. They are the closest thing to a time machine Sea Island cooking has produced. Number 19, field peas with snaps. Field peas were among the most important crops in the rural Black South during the Depression, and the church kitchen turned them into something that went far beyond survival. The peas were picked fresh in summer, shelled by hand on the front porch by whoever was available, children included, and cooked in a deep pot with a piece of salt pork or a smoked ham hock for seasoning. The snaps were the immature pods that had not fully developed peas inside. They went into the pot whole, adding a green, slightly fibrous texture that balanced the starchy richness of the mature peas. Low heat, enough water to cover, and patience. By the time they were done, the broth had thickened into a creamy liquid that tasted like pork and earth in summer all at once. In the church context, field peas were democratic. They grew in nearly every garden, required no expensive fertilizer, and a single bushel could feed a congregation. Women brought them already cooked in large bowls covered with dish towels. The pot liquor was soaked up with cornbread, and the peas were served alongside whatever meat was available that Sunday. In years when there was no meat, the peas were the meal. Protein, iron, fiber, all from a crop that grew in poor soil and asked for almost nothing in return. Black farmers had been growing them for generations before any government extension program said a word about it. The knowledge did not come from a pamphlet, it came from the ground, and the church table was where that knowledge fed people who had nowhere else to turn. A pot of field peas with snaps, served with cornbread and a glass of cold water, was a complete meal. It did not look like much. It did not need to. Number 28, squirrel stew. There is no soul food dish more honest about where it came from than this one. Hunting put meat on the table when the smokehouse was empty, and a couple of squirrels could feed a houseful with enough gravy and dumplings stretched around them. Archaeologists have found squirrel bones near old slave quarters, proof that this protein went back generations before anyone wrote it down. Big Mama browned the meat slow and let it simmer until the gravy turned the color of dark molasses. Served over rice or biscuits, it tasted like the woods in autumn. The Great Migration pulled families into city apartments with no hunting grounds within reach. A dish built on the land could not follow them onto the pavement. Number 14, dewberry ice cream. Every June, the ditches and fence rows of the rural South turned dark with dewberries. They grew low to the ground, tangled in thorns that tore at bare legs and forearms, and the only people who picked them were the ones who knew they were worth the trouble. Black grandmothers sent children out with lard buckets at dawn before the heat softened the fruit into mush. The berries came back warm and already bleeding through the tin. Some women cooked them down with sugar into a thick, almost black syrup, straining out the seeds through flour sackcloth. Others crushed them raw and folded the pulp straight into the cream base, seeds and all, because that was how their mothers did it. The churn turned slow. The color came out somewhere between purple and midnight blue, darker than any ice cream you could buy in a store. The taste was sharp and wild, nothing like a cultivated blackberry. There was a bitterness underneath the sweet that reminded you this fruit came from the edge of the road, not from a farm. Children who ate it remembered the stained fingers and the scratched up arms as much as the flavor. It was a full body experience, from the picking to the cranking to the eating. The juice got into your clothes and never fully washed out, and the mothers knew it before they sent you out, and they sent you out anyway. The dewberry patches still grow along every back road in Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, the Carolinas. They fruit every summer without anyone asking. But the women who knew how to turn those thorny, fragile berries into something worth sitting on a porch for are fewer every year. The buckets do not go out at dawn anymore. The ditches keep their fruit, and the birds take what the sun does not spoil. Number 23, fried cornmeal mush. Leftover grits from Tuesday did not get thrown away in a Harlem kitchen. Ever. Corrine poured the thick mush into a loaf pan and left it on the fire escape overnight to set. By morning, it was firm enough to slice. She cut the loaf into thick slabs, dredged them in dry meal, and fried them in fatback grease until the edges went gold and lacy. A drizzle of cane syrup on top, and that was breakfast for 4. The whole plate cost maybe 6 cents. Her father had eaten the same breakfast on a tenant farm in Sumter County decades earlier. He called it yesterday's supper, showing up for work again. That is frugality passed down through 3 generations. The kind of cooking your grandmother did not write down because nobody thought to ask. Blackstrap molasses as a daily tonic was a health practice passed through generations of African American families. A spoonful stirred into warm water or milk each morning was believed to strengthen blood, ease joint pain, and boost energy. Doctors dismissed it as folk superstition with no medical basis, pushing families toward commercial vitamins. But modern analysis shows blackstrap molasses is remarkably rich in iron, calcium, magnesium, potassium, and manganese, minerals that address deficiencies common in communities with limited dietary access. The iron content alone makes it one of the most effective plant-based sources for combating anemia. Scientists confirm this thick, dark syrup delivers concentrated minerals in bioavailable form that rivals supplements at a fraction of the cost. Skillet fried chicken livers were the appetizer that announced serious cooking was underway, served hot from the pan while the rest of the chicken finished frying. African American cooks dredged livers in seasoned flour and fried them quickly in the same oil, creating crispy exterior around creamy, iron-rich interior. The key was speed and high heat, cooking just until set inside while the coating turned golden. Overcooked livers turned grainy, but properly fried, they were silky and rich with concentrated chicken flavor. Children either loved them or refused to try them, creating memories that lasted lifetimes. Adults considered them a delicacy, often hiding them from younger diners. These livers provided essential iron during lean times when every part of the bird mattered. The tradition has disappeared as awful cooking fell from favor. Tamale pie crossed into black kitchen from the Southwest sometime in the 1960s, carried by a church potluck. Recipes and index cards, women traded at work. The filling was ground beef, browned with onion, green pepper, and garlic, stirred with chili powder, cumin, canned tomatoes, and kidney beans until it thickened into something halfway between chili and stew. Poured into a cast iron skillet, then topped with cornbread batter from a box of Jiffy Mix at 12 cents if time was short, and baked until the cornbread puffed golden and the filling bubbled through the cracks at the edges. The dish had been an American casserole since the early 1900s, but by the 70s, it had traveled far from its Tex-Mex origins into neighborhoods that seasoned it differently and used a heavier hand with the pepper. Nobody in those kitchens called it fusion. They called it supper, and the children fought over the corner pieces where the crust met the sauce. Smothered liver and onions divided households but fed families with iron-rich protein when budgets were tight. Beef or pork liver was sliced thin, soaked in milk to temper its metallic edge, then dredged in seasoned flour and fried until golden. Mountains of sliced onions were cooked down in the same skillet until they collapsed into sweet, caramelized strands, then piled atop the liver with rich gravy poured over everything. The combination was earthy and savory, with onions providing sweetness that balanced the liver's intensity. In the 1970s, liver was among the cheapest proteins available, appearing regularly on weeknight tables. Children often resisted until that first bite revealed something surprisingly delicious. This dish remains a memory of skill, transforming humble ingredients into meals worth remembering. Number 14, ham hocks. One smoked hock could flavor a whole pot and feed a whole table, which is exactly why it sat at the center of so many soul food kitchens. The hock is the joint above the pig's foot, smoked and salt cured, dropped into beans or greens to give the whole pot its deep, smoky backbone. It was the cheapest of cuts, the kind handed down from slavery when the good meat went elsewhere, and it became the seasoning that defined the cooking. By the 1960s, the ham hock drew notice on both counts that worried officials: the cured salt that the new blood pressure concern flagged, and the pork fat the heart studies warned about. Public health messaging of the era leaned on Southern families to season with less salt-cured meat. The cooks listened politely and dropped the hock in the pot all the same. The bulletin saw salt and fat. The family saw the soul of the dish. Number 21, groundnut stew. Peanuts ground to a paste, cooked into a chicken or guinea hen, broth with onion, sweet potato, hot pepper, and a thumb of fresh ginger. The Senegalese call it maafe. In Virginia, it was called peanut soup by 1810 and served in the great houses without anyone naming the kitchen that built it. Low country cooks made a thinner version with broken peanuts and ham broth, set on a rice plate like a bronze coin. The peanut was carried to West Africa by Portuguese ships in 1502 and back across the Atlantic in the holds of slave ships before 1700. By the time a Beaufort cook served it on a Sunday in 1875, the journey had been 3 crossings and 400 years. The peanut ended up in a chipped enamel bowl in a kitchen on Bay Street. You're tasting an itinerary as much as a stew. The broth is a passport. Number 20, Kush. Most people have never heard the word. Kush was yesterday's cornbread, crumbled into a skillet with a little bacon grease and fried until crispy on the outside. Some cookbooks added milk or buttermilk to the pan, turning it into a thick porridge. Others folded in diced onion. The Gullah Geechee version along the coast of South Carolina used crumbled cornbread with cane syrup and butter. Every version started with the same idea. Leftover cornbread was not waste. It was breakfast. In households where bread was baked every day and nothing was thrown out, Kush was the Monday morning answer to Sunday's extra pan. The name may trace back to couscous, carried from West Africa and adapted with the grains available here. By the 1970s, when sliced white bread and boxed cereal took over the morning table, Kush lost its reason to exist. Every recipe so far shares something in common. They required no trip to a store, no brand name, no packaging. Cracklings came from the hog you raised. Tomatoes came from the garden you kept. Poke grew in the ditch beside the road. Cornbread left over from last night became tomorrow's breakfast without anyone calling it a recipe. The entire system was built on what was already there, and that is exactly why the modern food industry had no use for it. You cannot sell a woman what she already grows, kills, preserves, and cooks from memory. The only way to replace her food was to make her children forget she ever knew how to make it. This is where the story reaches further back than the country itself. Number 17, sassafras tea. The roots of the sassafras tree grew wild across the South, and black families dug them up, scrubbed the bark clean, and boiled pieces of it in water until the liquid turned a reddish brown with a smell like root beer. Because Sassafras is where root beer originally came from. The tea was served hot in winter and cold in summer, sweetened with sugar or honey. Children drank it, adults drank it. It was free and it grew everywhere, along roadsides, at the edge of woods, in the strip of land between the yard and the field. Gathering the roots was a chore that fell to whoever had the time, and cleaning them was slow work, but the tea itself required nothing more than water and heat. It tasted like something between birch and vanilla, earthy and sweet at once. Number 8, conch stew. Your conch was harvested from the deeper offshore waters by Gula men who knew exactly where the shells gathered on the sandy bottom. The meat was tough and required pounding with a wooden mallet for 10 minutes, like beating a drum before it would surrender. Cubed and tossed with flour, the conch was browned in bacon fat with onion, celery, and bell pepper. A quart of water, a can of crushed tomato, a bay leaf, and a pinch of allspice went in next. The pot simmered for an hour and a half until your conch turned tender and the stew thickened. It was ladled over rice. Charlotte Jenkins, who ran the Gula Cuisine restaurant in Mount Pleasant for years, kept her grandmother's conch stew on the menu until the day she closed. A bowl tied your low country kitchen back to the Caribbean, from which the recipe and the people had originally crossed. Number 7, smothered shrimp with Sea Island red peas. In August, the heat was so heavy that your Gula grandmother would never dream of cooking inside the house. Your yard kitchen was set up under a roof of palmetto fronds with an iron stove and a long wooden table. Fresh creek shrimp, peeled and cleaned, went into a pan with bacon grease, sliced sweet onion, and a heavy crack of black pepper. The shrimp cooked in 3 minutes flat like a quick spell. Number 20, glazed ham. A whole ham at a black church supper during the Depression was a statement. It meant somebody had raised a hog and done the smoking themselves. The glaze was made from whatever sweetener was available: brown sugar, sorghum, or cane syrup mixed with mustard and a little vinegar. Whole cloves were pressed into the scored fat in diamond patterns. The ham went into the oven and was basted every 30 minutes until the outside turned dark and glossy. A single ham fed 40 people when carved thin enough. The children circled back for the burnt edges where the sugar had caramelized against the bone. When the ham was gone, the supper was over. The bone went home with whoever was making soup that week. Here's something worth saying out loud. The black church during the Great Depression was not simply a place of worship. It was a survival system. When federal relief programs offered almost nothing to black families, and when white relief agencies turned them away, the church filled the gap with the only currency it had: food. Women who could barely feed their own children cooked for entire congregations. They pooled flour and lard the way banks were supposed to pool money. They organized meal rotations so no family went an entire week without a hot plate. The recipes on this list did not come from cookbooks. They came from necessity and the absolute refusal to let hunger win on a Sunday. Number 16, rabbit okra soup. Trace this soup backward and it draws a straight line from the country to the city and shows you exactly where a dish goes to die. A rabbit caught in the morning went into the pot with okra, tomatoes, corn, and whatever the garden gave, simmered until the okra thickened it into a stew you could stand a spoon in. It was rural self-sufficiency in a bowl, a meal that asked only a snare and a patch of dirt. The okra tied it to West Africa, and the rabbit tied it to the land. City life took away the snare, the garden, and the afternoon all at once. A soup that needed the countryside could not be made on a fire escape. Number 18, banana ice cream. Overripe bananas, mashed with a fork until they turned to paste, folded into sweetened cream with a drop of vanilla. no chunks, smooth all the way through. This was Depression-era practical. Bananas that had gone too far for eating, skins blackened and soft, found a second life in the freezer. Children loved it because it tasted like banana pudding in frozen form. It asked nothing expensive of the family, just patience at the crank. The color came out pale yellow, almost ivory, and it had a creaminess that store-bought banana ice cream has never matched. That is because grocery store versions use artificial flavoring and food coloring to fake the fruit. The real thing needed only the fruit itself. Some grandmothers roasted the bananas in the oven first, bringing out a deeper, almost caramel sweetness that clung to the back of the tongue. Others mashed them raw and stirred in a teaspoon of lemon juice to keep the color from turning gray. In households where money was especially thin, banana ice cream stretched a single pint of cream into enough dessert for a whole table. The bananas did the heavy lifting. The cream was just the ride. Number 18, fried sweet potato slices. Imagine the cheapest side dish in all of Harlem. A single sweet potato cost 2 cents on 135th Street. Kareem peeled it, sliced it thin as a dime, and fried the rounds in bacon grease until the edges caramelized into a kind of crunchy candy. A sprinkle of salt, a shake of cinnamon, and that was a side that went with anything. Pork chops, chicken, neck bones, greens. The sweetness cut through the salt the way a singer cuts through a noisy room. It was beautiful cooking made from nothing. And here's the part that surprised me when I dug into the research. Fried sweet potato slices were not a southern dish transplanted. They were invented in the northern kitchens up in Harlem and Pittsburgh and Detroit by women who arrived with nothing but a cast iron pan and a memory of their mother's garden. They adapted. They made sweetness work in a kitchen 6 feet wide. Kareem taught the same trick to her landlady's daughter, a girl of 12 named Hazel, who was born in New York and had never seen a sweet potato pulled from red dirt. Hazel would cook them the same way for her own children in the 1950s and her grandchildren in the 1980s. That is how a recipe survives the war, the depression, and 2 generations of moving trucks. 1 cast iron pan, 1 thin slice, 1 cheap sweet potato that became a part of who the family was. Every time you smell that caramel edge coming up from the grease, you are standing in a chain that runs back to a laundress on Sugar Hill in 1928. That is not nostalgia. That is a working woman's gift to a century she would never see. Fermented corn drinks and porridges were a dietary tradition carried from West Africa into African American kitchens, where families allowed corn-based mixtures to sour naturally before cooking them. Health authorities viewed fermentation as spoilage and warned families to discard anything that had turned. But the process was intentional and rooted in ancestral knowledge. Scientists now understand that naturally fermented corn produces beneficial lactobacillus, bacteria that strengthen gut health and improve digestion. The fermentation increases bioavailability of B vitamins and breaks down phytic acid, which blocks mineral absorption. Communities consuming fermented porridges were building stronger immune systems and extracting more nutrition from a staple crop. What officials called spoiled food was a sophisticated nutrition technique. Fried chicken backs and necks were the pieces that never made it to the platter, but always disappeared first in kitchens where nothing went to waste. These bony cuts were seasoned with garlic powder, onion salt, and cayenne, then fried until the small pockets of meat turned crispy and bones became almost edible. African American cooks knew that backs and necks held concentrated flavor that breast meat could never deliver. Children gnawed on these pieces like prizes, sucking the marrow while adults prepared presentable cuts for guests. Butchers sold these cuts for pennies, making them essential for families stretching budgets while still delivering satisfaction. Today, most backs and necks end up in stock pots or discarded entirely, but once they were the cook's reward and children's favorite secret. The smell of hamburger gravy meant it was the end of the month. You knew before you walked into the kitchen. Flour browning in hot fat, the sharp hit of black pepper, the soft thud of a wooden spoon against cast iron. Your mother browned a half-pound of ground beef, crumbled it fine, left every drop of grease in the pan, sprinkled flour over the top, and stirred until it turned golden. Milk went in slow, and she kept stirring until the whole thing thickened into a pale brown blanket that clung to the spoon. Poured over split buttermilk biscuits, it was dinner. The dish had roots in the military, where servicemen called it SOS, but in black kitchens, it was simply gravy and biscuits. No pretense, a full meal for 4 people on less than 70 cents. Nobody called it struggle food, not once, because when it was made right, it tasted like being taken care of. And the woman who made it would never tell you she skipped her own plate so there was enough for everyone else. Neck bone stew with potatoes was cold weather comfort that simmered all day and fed families all week. Pork neck bones were browned until caramelized, then covered with water and cooked slowly with onions, garlic, and bay leaves. Potatoes and carrots were added in the final hours, absorbing the rich broth flavored by marrow and rendered fat. The meat became so tender it slid from the bone, while the potatoes broke down slightly to thicken the stew naturally. Served in deep bowls with crusty bread or cornbread, this stew warmed bodies and spirits during the coldest months. Mothers started the pot before dawn, letting it bubble gently while they worked, filling homes with aromas that drew children to the kitchen. Neckbone stew taught that time and patience were ingredients as important as anything bought at the store. Number 20, pig feet. Slow simmered until the skin went to silk and the bones gave up their richness, pig feet were a poor table's luxury. They were boiled for hours with vinegar and pepper, sometimes pickled in a jar and eaten cold, sometimes served hot and falling apart over rice. Like so much of soul food, the feet were an offcut the enslaved were left with and turned into something worth waiting all day for. They carried the same official suspicion as the other raw pork parts during the 1960s sanitation campaigns, since handling fresh trotters meant handling raw hog that could carry bacteria into the kitchen. Health departments of the era pressed the message of careful cleaning and thorough cooking for all such cuts, the same drumbeat aimed at chitlins and maws. Cooks already knew to boil the feet long and hard until the meat all but melted, and they kept right on doing it. The warnings worried about the bacteria, but the pot kept its promise. Number 17, collards with pot liquor. A bunch of dark green leaves, washed 3 times in cold water, the stems stripped out, the leaves cut into ribbons, a smoked ham hock, 3 quarts of water, vinegar, hot pepper. 6 hours on the stove until the leaves were almost black and the broth ran the color of strong tea. The plantation house ate the leaves. The kitchen kept the broth. That broth, the pot liquor, was where the iron was, where the vitamin C was, where the vitamin K was. It was passed across to a child with a piece of cornbread for sopping. West Africa had over 150 edible greens before the rice ships ever sailed. The technique of cooking them down and drinking the juice came with the people who knew which leaf belonged in which pot. Your grandmother saved the broth because hers did. She didn't know the science. She knew the rule. Number 15, souse meat. After hog killing day, when the hams and shoulders had been salted and stored, what remained was the head. Souse meat was the answer. The hog head was simmered in a large pot with vinegar, onions, and hot peppers until the meat fell apart. The liquid cooled into a stiff gelatin that held the shredded meat in place. It was poured into loaf pans, chilled, and sliced cold. Some cookbooks called it head cheese. In Black households across the Deep South, it was simply part of the rhythm of winter. The hog was killed, the head was boiled, the souse was made. Sliced thin with crackers and pepper vinegar, it was one of the only cold meats available before refrigeration. The texture was firm and the gelatin visible, a window into another era's relationship with the animal. Today, it survives in a handful of country butcher shops in Mississippi and eastern North Carolina, and almost nowhere else. There is a pattern running through this list that deserves a name. Every recipe lost so far was lost the same way. Not by failure, not by taste, by convenience. A product appeared on a shelf. It was faster, it was wrapped in plastic, it came with instructions printed on the back, and the thing it replaced, the thing that took all day and required knowledge passed from hand to hand, simply stopped being worth the trouble to the next generation. Nobody made a decision to stop cooking. The recipes just drifted out of reach, one Thanksgiving at a time, one grandmother at a time, until the old cookbooks were the only place they still lived. Number 25, chow chow relish. Every fall, Black grandmothers across the Carolinas and Appalachia pulled out the canning jars and started chopping. Chow chow was a pickled relish made from the last vegetables of the season: green tomatoes, cabbage, onions, and peppers, all chopped fine and cooked down in vinegar with mustard seed, celery seed, and turmeric. The recipe changed from kitchen to kitchen because the whole point was using whatever the garden still had. One household made it sweeter, another made it so hot it cleared the sinuses. It went on top of pinto beans, beside black-eyed peas, and next to any piece of pork that touched a plate. A single batch could fill dozens of jars, and those jars traveled. They showed up at church, at neighbors' doors, and in the bags of grown children heading back to the city after a visit. The giving was the tradition as much as the making. Most families stopped growing their own gardens by the 1990s, and without the garden, there was nothing left over to pickle. Chow chow did not fade because people lost the recipe. It faded because they lost the rose. Number 22, Geechee fried fish breakfast. The whiting came in at first light, gutted on the dock, walked back to the kitchen in a galvanized pail. The fillet was rolled in fine yellow cornmeal, seasoned with salt, black pepper, and a whisper of cayenne. It went into a cast iron pan of hot lard and crisped on each side in 3 minutes. Beside it on the plate, soft white grits. Beneath it, a piece of cornbread to catch the oil. This was breakfast, not toast, not cereal, not anything you could buy at a counter. A boy on St. Helena ate it before walking 2 miles to the Penn School in 1948, and he considered himself well fed. The fish cost nothing. The cornmeal cost almost nothing. The lard came from a hog the family slaughtered themselves the previous winter. Number 24, chicken hash. This was not the brunch item served in hotel restaurants today. In Black church kitchens, during the 1930s, chicken hash meant taking every last scrap off a bird that had already given its broth to Sunday's soup. The leftover meat was chopped fine, mixed with diced potatoes and onion, seasoned with salt, black pepper, and sage, then fried in a cast iron skillet with bacon drippings until the bottom turned crisp. The dish stretched one chicken across 2 meals for a family of 6. The crisp bottom layer was scraped up with a spatula and served alongside the soft hash on top. Simple, resourceful, and completely invisible to anyone who did not grow up watching a grandmother strip a carcass bare with her fingers. Number 22, the Sunday dinner that held the family together. This is not a single recipe so much as the heartbeat the other recipes lived inside, and it deserves a moment of its own. Picture the kitchen on a Sunday morning across the rural South and the migration cities alike. The woman everyone called Big Mama had been up since before light, and by the time church let out, the whole house already smelled of it. There were the greens, cooking down low with a piece of smoked meat, the chicken frying in the heavy pan, the pots of rice and beans, the pan of cornbread cooling on the windowsill. She did not work from a card, she worked from her hands, from 40 years of knowing when the grease whispered that it was ready and when the greens had given up their bitterness. The grandchildren were sent to set the table and shell the peas, and in that sending, the recipes passed down without a word being written. Aunts argued over whether there was enough salt, and somebody always said it needed more. A neighbor who had no people of her own knew there was always a plate waiting, no matter how thin the week had been. This was the engine room of the family, the place where the week was repaired and the children were fed and the old folks were honored. The food was the language, but the table was the point. When she was gone, the chicken could be fried by somebody else and the greens could be cooked again. Yet the gravity that pulled everyone into one room on one afternoon was the thing that truly vanished. We can write down a recipe. We have never learned to write down a Sunday like that. The dish that disappeared was never really a dish at all. Number 21, lemon icebox ice cream. Fresh lemons squeezed until the juice ran clear, sugar dissolved in cream over low heat, and the whole thing churned fast before the acid could curdle the milk. This was the ice cream for church picnics when peaches were not yet ripe and nothing else was in season. The lemon made it feel lighter than it was, almost like drinking the cold lemonade through a spoon. Women in Tennessee and North Carolina knew that the secret was speed. You had to churn it the moment the lemon hit the cream. Wait too long, and the acid seized the fat and you had cottage cheese. Some women added a pinch of salt to slow the reaction. Others folded in a spoonful of condensed milk to stabilize the whole thing. Either way, the technique was learned through failure. Every woman who made lemon icebox ice cream could tell you about the first batch she threw behind the house. The good batch, though, tasted like summer itself. Sharp, bright, cold enough to make your teeth ache. It never kept well. By the next morning, it turned grainy and lost its edge. That was the point. You ate it the day it was made on a church lawn before the sun took it back. Number 5, chicken and waffles, Harlem style. Long before Wells opened his famous supper club in 1938, chicken and waffles were already a Harlem late-night institution. Saloons on 133rd Street served the combination to musicians coming off their shift at 3 in the morning. It was breakfast and dinner at once. Corrine made her own waffles in a cast iron waffle iron held over the gas ring, 2 minutes aside, flipped by hand. She fried the chicken in a black skillet with lard and flour dredging. A plate arrived with crisp bird on top of a hot waffle with maple syrup pooling in the squares. At the Tree of Hope, a plate went for 60 cents. Corrine made it at home for 18. The musicians paid for the show. She paid for the flour. Chewing sugar cane straight from the stalk was a common practice among African American children and field workers in the Deep South, where cane grew abundantly. As refined sugar and processed sweets became widely available, raw sugar cane was dismissed as primitive and unsanitary. Dentists warned it would destroy teeth, and health officials saw no value in the practice. But scientists have since discovered that raw sugar cane juice contains polyphenols, antioxidants, and minerals, including iron, calcium, and magnesium, that refine sugar strips away entirely. The fibrous chewing action also stimulates saliva production, which naturally protects tooth enamel, the opposite of what dentists feared. Families who let children chew cane stalks were providing natural nutrients and oral health benefits that processed sugar could never deliver. Fried chicken with pepper vinegar was a combination that shocked visitors but delighted those raised on its sharp, bright flavor. The pepper vinegar was made by steeping hot peppers in white vinegar for weeks until the liquid turned fiery and complex. After the chicken came out of the fryer, still glistening and crackling hot, diners shook this pungent condiment directly onto the crispy coating. The vinegar cut through the richness while the pepper heat built slowly, creating layers plain fried chicken couldn't deliver. African American households kept bottles of pepper vinegar on the table year-round, using it on greens, beans, and especially fried chicken. Making pepper vinegar was a household tradition, with each family guarding their ratio of peppers to vinegar. This condiment elevated fried chicken to something memorable. She started those pinto beans the night before, always the night before. Dried pintos soaked in water on the counter while the house slept, and by morning, they were swollen and ready. A half pound of ground beef went in first, browned with onion and garlic, and then the drained beans on top with enough water to cover by 2 inches. Bay leaf, salt pork if she had it. That pot sat on a back burner all afternoon, lid cracked, filling the house with a smell that told every child on the block what was for dinner. Slow cooking legumes with small amounts of meat traces directly to West African one-pot stews, and in the rural South, pinto beans had been stretching meals since long before emancipation. By the early 1970s, a bag of dried pintos cost 15 cents, the beef about 60, and the whole pot fed 8 with cornbread on the side. You knew they were done when the broth turned creamy on its own, without adding a thing. Fried corn with bacon was summer captured in a skillet, celebrating the brief weeks when fresh corn overflowed from gardens and roadside stands. Kernels were cut from the cob, then scraped to release the milky liquid that would thicken the dish. Bacon was fried until crisp, then crumbled while the corn cooked in the rendered fat, caramelizing slightly at the edges. Onion, salt, and pepper were all the seasoning needed when the corn was this fresh. The dish came together quickly, but delivered sweetness, smoke, and richness in every spoonful. In the 1970s, fried corn appeared at summer cookouts and weeknight suppers when gardens produced more than families could eat fresh. This was seasonal cooking at its purest, impossible to replicate with frozen corn. Number 23, crackling cornbread. This was cornbread with the gift of the hog baked right into it. Cracklings are the crisp little bits of pork skin and fat left over after rendering lard, salty and crunchy, and folding a handful into the cornmeal batter turned plain bread into something a family fought over. It was thrift-made delicious, every scrap of the pig used, nothing wasted, a habit carried straight out of slave quarter kitchens where the offcuts were all anybody got. Then came the 1960s and the rising concern over saturated fat in the new heart studies, and cracklings were exactly the kind of pork fat indulgence the new guidance frowned on. After the American Heart Association issued its first warning on saturated fat, public health writers of the era began naming lard-rich breads among the foods to cut back on for the sake of the heart. Some county leaflets even printed cornbread recipes stripped of the cracklings. But crackling cornbread was a holiday on a plate, the crunch of the pork skin against the soft crumb, and nobody was giving that up over a pamphlet. It went on getting baked in the same black skillet and carried hot to the table. The officials counted the grease while the family counted the slices. Number 24, Hoppin' John, black-eyed peas, long grain rice, a smoked ham hock, 1 yellow onion, water, salt. The peas came over in the bilges of the slave ships, sometimes packed as cheap protein for the captives, sometimes hidden in a bundle of cloth. In Senegal, the dish is called thiebu niebe, served with smoked fish over rice on a tin platter. In Charleston, it became Hoppin' John by 1840 and a New Year ritual by 1900. The cowpea was a sign of protection in Senegambia, a charm against famine, the way a horseshoe was a charm in another world. Your great-grandmother would put a dime in the pot and tell the children whoever found it would have a good year. She didn't invent that. She inherited it from a coast that taught her grandmother how to count luck in legumes. The dish is still on every Black New Year table from Charleston to Savannah. Number 21, sweet potato pone. This was not sweet potato pie and not sweet potato casserole. Sweet potato pone was older than both. The recipe appeared in handwritten church cookbooks from the 1880s across Georgia, Alabama, and the Mississippi Delta. Raw sweet potatoes were grated by hand on a box grater, mixed with molasses, butter, eggs, and spices, then baked slow until the top cracked and the center set dense and dark, almost like a pudding. It took close to 2 hours in a wood-fired oven. The texture was heavy, somewhere between cornbread and fudge, and it was eaten warm with nothing on top. Grating enough sweet potato for a family of 8 meant raw knuckles and sore arms. When canned sweet potatoes and pre-made pie crusts showed up in stores in the 1950s, sweet potato pone was one of the first recipes to drop out of the rotation. Nobody noticed until the hands that grated them were gone. Number 10, clabber biscuits. Clabber was raw milk left to sour and thicken at room temperature until it set into something between yogurt and soft cheese. Black families who kept cows or bought milk from a neighbor used clabber in place of buttermilk to make biscuits that were tender, tangy, and rose high in the oven without any baking powder. The acid in the clabber reacted with baking soda and did all the lifting. The biscuits had a flavor that store-bought buttermilk could not replicate, slightly funky, richer, and more complex. Making clabber required no effort at all, just time and unpasteurized milk. A jar sat on the counter for a day or two and nature did the rest. When pasteurization became standard and raw milk moved out of daily life, clabber disappeared from most kitchens. Without clabber, the biscuits changed. They were still good, they were not the same. Number 17, field pea soup with smoked hocks. The pea was the Sea Island red pea, a small dark legume Gula families had been growing in side yard plots for 200 years. A cup of dried peas was rinsed, picked over for stones, and dropped into a pot with the smoked ham hock from the previous winter's hog. Onion, garlic, a sprig of thyme, water. It cooked for 3 hours like a slow clock. The hock fell apart, the peas softened into a thick brown porridge, and the broth turned almost meaty. A bowl with rice and cornbread fed your working man for the whole afternoon. The Sea Island red pea nearly went extinct in the 20th century when commercial farms switched to the cheaper black-eyed pea. Today, it's grown again by a handful of low-country farmers. The grandmothers never stopped saving the seeds. They knew what they had. Number 14, baked hen with pan gravy. A baked hen was the queen of the black church table during the Depression, and the gravy made from her drippings was the crown. The bird was typically an old laying hen past her prime, too tough for frying, but perfect for slow roasting. She was seasoned inside and out with salt, black pepper, and whatever dried herbs were on hand. Onion quarters went into the cavity. Then she went into a heavy roasting pan at a moderate heat for several hours, basted with her own fat every 30 minutes until the skin turned deep golden brown and the leg pulled away from the body with almost no resistance. The gravy was where the real craft lived. Once the hen came out, the drippings stayed in the bottom of the pan, rendered fat, caramelized juice, and whatever had stuck to the metal. Flour was sprinkled directly into the hot drippings and stirred with a wooden spoon until it formed a paste. Then milk was added slowly, a little at a time, while the cook stirred without stopping. The gravy thickened into something rich and brown, with small dark flecks of seasoning suspended throughout. This was not a complicated dish, but it required experience, knowing when the hen was done by pressing the thigh, knowing how much flour to add by feel, knowing how fast to pour so the gravy did not lump. These skills did not come from a cookbook. They came from watching a mother or a grandmother make the same dish 100 times in the same kitchen with the same pan. Nobody wrote the ratio down because nobody needed to. The hands remembered. The hen fed the table. The gravy fed the soul. Number 14, egg custard pie. Some desserts shout, and this one only ever whispered, which is part of why it slipped away. Big Mama beat together eggs, sugar, and milk, dusted the top with nutmeg, and baked it just until the center barely held its shape. There was no fruit to hide behind and no chocolate to lean on, only the plain, honest taste of the few things a poor pantry always had. It was the pie you could make on a Tuesday when there was nothing fancy in the house, the pie that stretched a half dozen eggs into Sunday comfort. Country churches knew it well because it traveled in a tin and never spoiled the way cream pies did in the heat. But supermarket bakeries chased flash and color, and a pale brown custard looked like nothing on a shelf. The simplest pie in the South became the one nobody bothers to bake. Number 24, sweet potato ice cream. Roasted sweet potatoes mashed smooth, folded into a custard base with cinnamon, nutmeg, and a pinch of clove. This tasted like Thanksgiving in a bowl. The color was deep gold. Families across the Carolina Low Country and Georgia made this in the fall when sweet potatoes came in heavy from the garden. There was no recipe card. You watched your grandmother press the potatoes through a sieve with the heel of her hand, and you remembered. When she passed, so did the exact ratio of spice to cream that made hers different from the neighbors. But before the garden gave anything, before the beans had soaked overnight, there was couscous, and it kept people moving when nothing else was in the house. A Senegambian dish documented in WPA slave narratives from Texas, couscous traveled across the Atlantic in the memory of West African captives who had eaten a version of it for generations. Coarse cornmeal poured into a dry, hot iron skillet with a little lard, stirred until it browned and formed a crust, then scraped up and served with cane syrup poured over the top. The result was crispy in patches, soft underneath, sweet from the syrup, smoky from the iron, a breakfast that cost almost nothing and tasted like something worth waking early for. In the 1920s, cane syrup was the cheapest sweetener in rural Louisiana and Mississippi. Nobody makes couscous anymore. The woman who made it every morning is not here to make it. If beans simmered all day on one burner, the other belonged to whatever the garden gave. Salted and smoked meats for preservation were essential survival techniques in African American households long before refrigeration existed. Families cured pork with heavy salt, hung it in smokehouses, and stored it for months through entire winters. Health officials later warned these methods produced excessive sodium and carcinogenic compounds, pushing families toward processed alternatives. But recent science re-examined traditional smoking and found that coal smoking at low temperatures produced far fewer harmful compounds than industrial processing. The salt in-home curing acted as a natural antimicrobial without chemical additives, found in modern deli meats. Scientists now acknowledge traditionally smoked meats were safer and more nutritious than factory replacements. Cornmeal-crusted fried chicken offered texture that pure flour coating couldn't match, adding sandy crunch and subtle sweetness to every bite. The coating mixed fine cornmeal with flour, salt, pepper, and paprika, creating a dredge that fried into something between traditional fried chicken and hush puppies. African American cooks favored this variation because cornmeal was cheaper and more available than wheat flour, stretching limited resources without sacrificing flavor. The cornmeal crust turned a deep golden in hot oil and held its crunch longer than flour alone, ideal for church suppers where food sat waiting. The flavor was distinctly Southern, that familiar corn taste underlying the savory chicken and spices. This regional variation has largely disappeared, replaced by flour-only coating that dominates modern recipes. There was a certain pride in the way she set those stuffed bell peppers on the table, 4 of them standing upright in a baking dish, tops sliced off like little hats, each one filled with a mound of seasoned beef and rice that rose just above the rim. Ground beef browned with onion and garlic, mixed with cooked rice, a small can of tomato sauce, salt, pepper, and whatever dried herbs lived in the cabinet. Spooned into hollowed peppers, set in a dish with a little water at the bottom, sauce poured over the tops, baked until the peppers softened and the edges charred. Green peppers cost about 5 cents each in 1970, and the whole dish came under $1.50. What made it feel like a real dinner was the presentation. Each person got their own pepper, their own vessel. It turned a cheap Tuesday into something worth sitting down for, and that act of making the ordinary feel special was something she never stopped doing, even when nobody thanked her for it. Chitlin loaf took the intense flavor of chitterlings and transformed them into something sliceable and easier for skeptics to approach. Cleaned and cooked chitterlings were ground or chopped fine, mixed with cornmeal, eggs, onions, and seasonings, then packed into loaf pans and baked until firm. The result was dense and savory, with the distinctive chitlin flavor mellowed by the cornmeal binder. Sliced and fried until crispy on the outside, chitlin loaf became breakfast alongside eggs or dinner with greens. This dish represented innovation born from tradition, finding new ways to enjoy ancestral foods. In the 1970s, chitlin loaf appeared at church suppers and family gatherings. The dish has nearly vanished, known only to those who remember kitchens where creativity transformed humble ingredients. Number 24, fried chicken cooked in lard. Nothing said the preacher was coming to dinner like a skillet of chicken popping in a deep pool of hog lard. For generations, the fat of choice was lard, scooped from a tin and melted down until a dropped crumb sizzled and floated. The bird went in dredged and seasoned, and the lard gave that shattering, deep gold crust no vegetable oil could match. When the saturated fat campaigns picked up steam through the 1960s, lard became the villain of the cooking world, and health bulletins pushed families toward the new hydrogenated shortenings and bottled oils instead. Shortening makers leaned hard into that message, running ad after ad that framed lard as old-fashioned and bad for the heart. County nutrition columns echoed the same advice, telling readers to set the lard tin aside and pour from a bottle. Black cooks who had fried in lard since slavery knew the difference on the tongue and resisted the swap, since the new oils gave a paler, greasier crust and none of the deep flavor. Sunday chicken stayed in the lard pot in most kitchens, no matter what the leaflet said, and the platter still came out heaped and golden after church. The warning changed the label on the can, never the skillet on the stove. Number 20, Country Captain. Spatchcocked chicken, seared in lard, then simmered with curry powder, tomato, currants, almonds, onion, and green pepper. Charleston and Savannah were two of the busiest port cities on the Atlantic seaboard in 1790. Ships from the East India Company called Charleston Harbor a country port. Country Captain came off those vessels with a Bengali cook and an English captain who had a kitchen but no recipe. Low country African-American cooks adopted it, traded the ghee for bacon grease, and kept the curry. By 1900, it was a Sunday supper in Black Charleston households where nobody had ever seen India and nobody needed to. The dish is a quiet record of 3 continents that met in one Carolina pot. The currants came from Greece. The almonds came from Spain. The curry came from Calcutta in a sailor's pocket. You can serve it tonight and you'll be eating a trade route. Number 14, neck bone perlou. Along the coast of South Carolina and Georgia in the low country where African, Caribbean, and Southern food traditions mixed for 300 years, rice was the center of the plate. Perlou was the dish that made the least amount of meat feed the most people. Smoked pork neck bones were simmered in water with onion, garlic, and bay leaf until the broth was rich and the meat was tender enough to pull clean. Then raw rice was stirred directly into the pot and the lid sealed. The rice absorbed every trace of smoke and fat and salt. The word perlou likely comes from pilau, a technique that traveled through Persia and West Africa before arriving in the Low Country with enslaved people who already knew how to cook rice better than anyone on the continent. 2 or 3 neck bones, which cost almost nothing because nobody with money wanted them, could produce enough perlou to fill 8 or 10 plates. A single pot, 1 burner, rice that cooked in its own sauce. The Gullah Geechee communities along the Sea Islands kept this tradition alive longer than most, but by the 1990s, the old-style perlou was fading. Neck bones cost more now. The young people moved to Atlanta and Charlotte, and the rice that once grew in those same coastal fields has not been commercially harvested in South Carolina since the early 1900s. The old community cookbooks from Beaufort and Charleston recorded what the hands already knew: a cup of rice per person, enough broth to cover by 1 inch, and the patience to leave the lid alone. Number 18, vinegar pie. This one surprises people. A pie made with vinegar, sugar, eggs, butter, and a little flour, baked in a single crust. Tastes like a cross between chess pie and lemon meringue, tangy and sweet with the custard center. Black families in Appalachia and the Upper South made vinegar pie when lemons were unavailable or too expensive, which for most of the year in rural areas they were. The acidity of the vinegar did the same work a lemon would, and the result was honest and good. It cost almost nothing. A bottle of vinegar lasted months. This is not a novelty. It is a solution born from knowing how flavor actually works. Number 16, boiled peanuts. The green peanut came out of the field in late summer, still in its odd, damp shell before it had a chance to dry. It was washed, dropped into a pot of heavily salted water, and simmered for 4 hours until the shell turned soft and the kernel inside was a little tender and a little briny, like a small pickled bean. The cook tasted one every 30 minutes until the salt was right. A child on John's Island would eat them by the handful out of a paper cone and spit the soft shells into the dirt road. They were your porch snack, a long drive snack, a churchyard snack. Almost nothing else in American food eats like a boiled peanut. They are warm, salty, soft, and faintly sweet at the same time. A pound of green peanuts cost a dime in 1960. A bowl could keep your porch full of cousins quiet for an hour. Number 22, pear salad. This was one of the strangest looking dishes on the church table and one of the most beloved. A canned pear, half placed cut side up on a leaf of iceberg lettuce, the hollow filled with a spoonful of mayonnaise, and the whole thing topped with a sprinkle of grated cheddar cheese. That was it. Canned pears were cheap and available year-round at any general store. The dish required no cooking, no oven, and no skill beyond opening a can and arranging a plate. Church women assembled dozens of them on long trays before the congregation arrived. Children ate them with their fingers. Adults pretended not to. The combination of cold, sweet fruit, sharp cheese, and mayonnaise made no sense on paper, but made perfect sense on a paper plate at a summer revival. Number 18, apple stack cake. This towering dessert was a community in cake form, and that is exactly why it disappeared. Each thin molasses and ginger layer was baked separately, then stacked with spice-dried apple filling until the cake stood tall and proud. At a country gathering, families would each bring a layer to donate, and the number of layers a couple received was said to measure how well loved they were. It needed days because the apples had to soften the dry cake into something sliceable. Nobody made this alone, and nobody made it fast. A cake that measured a family's friendships became too much work for one pair of hands. Number 16, fig ice cream. Ripe figs from the tree in the yard, cooked down with sugar into a thick jam, then swirled through the custard base. Figs do not ship well. They bruise if you look at them wrong. So this ice cream only existed where fig trees grew, and only in the 2 or 3 weeks of late summer when the fruit came ripe all at once. Mississippi, Alabama, South Georgia. Families who had a fig tree made this. Families who did not traded for it. When those yards got sold and the trees cut down, the recipe had nowhere left to live. Number 3, pigfoot and a pot of rice. Bessie Smith sang about a pigfoot and a bottle of beer for a reason. In 1928, a boiled pigfoot was 12 cents at any 7th Avenue lunch counter. Corrine cooked them at home in a tall pot with vinegar, hot pepper, bay leaf, and onion for 3 hours until the skin went tender and the broth went cloudy with gelatin. She served them over white rice with the cloudy broth ladled on top. The flavor was sharp, porky, tangy, and halfway between a pickle and a pot roast. A plate cost 20 cents at the bar on the corner. Corrine made it at home for 6. And it was the supper that launched 1,000 rent parties across Harlem on Friday nights when the landlord was coming Monday. Black walnut cooking and baking was a cherished autumn tradition in African American families, especially in the Upper South where wild trees grew abundantly. Families gathered fallen nuts, cracked them by hand, and used the rich meat in cakes, cookies, and candied treats. Commercial production ignored black walnuts in favor of milder English walnuts, dismissing the wild variety as too bitter. But research revealed black walnuts contain significantly higher levels of omega-3 fatty acids, antioxidants, and anti-inflammatory compounds than commercial counterparts. The bitterness that made them unpopular signaled polyphenols now linked to heart health and cancer prevention. Families who foraged these stubborn nuts were harvesting one of nature's most powerful health foods. Pan-fried chicken with cream gravy was weeknight comfort that turned a simple bird into a meal worth remembering. The chicken pieces were dredged in seasoned flour and cooked slowly in cast iron with just enough shortening to come halfway up the sides. This was patient pan frying, turning pieces until the crust developed perfect golden brown. Once removed, Flour was whisked into the drippings, followed by whole milk that bubbled and thickened into velvety cream gravy. The gravy carried all the seasoning and foam from the chicken, pale and rich with tiny flecks throughout. Families poured it generously over the chicken alongside mashed potatoes, letting everything mingle. This technique required attention and skill, knowing exactly when to flip and how much milk to add. Modern shortcuts have replaced this slow method. If the skillet meals kept you fed, the stews kept you warm, and when the weather turned cold and the gas bill climbed, ground beef and tomato stew appeared on stoves across every black neighborhood that knew a hard November. Most families never gave it a proper name. They called it stew or soup or whatever's in the pot. Browned beef, diced potatoes, carrots, a can of whole tomatoes crushed by hand, an onion cut rough, and enough water to cover, salt, pepper, garlic powder, bay leaf, and thyme. An hour on low, and the potatoes thickened the broth on their own, the carrots softened, and the tomatoes dissolved until the pot turned deep rust. Families who came north during the migration recognized it immediately. A city grocery adaptation of the vegetable soups their grandmothers made in Mississippi, adjusted for whatever the corner store carried in January. A full pot cost $1 and change, fed 7 people, and reheated even better with cornbread crumbled into the bowl. Hog maw stuffed with sausage was the centerpiece of holiday tables in black households throughout the 1970s, a dish that demanded respect and patience in equal measure. The hog's stomach was cleaned meticulously for hours, then stuffed with seasoned sausage, potatoes, onions, and cabbage before slow roasting until golden and crisp. This dish filled homes with an aroma that announced celebration. Families gathered as it was sliced thick and served alongside greens, each portion carrying the richness of rendered fat and spiced meat. The stomach itself cost almost nothing, yet transformed into something that fed a crowd and honored tradition. Today, it has nearly disappeared, but those who remember it recall the pride of serving something so deeply rooted in heritage. Number 16, chitterlings, the dish that set off a real public sanitation alert. Chitterlings, or chitlins, are the small intestines of the hog, and cleaning them is the hardest, slowest, most exacting job in soul food cooking. Every length has to be turned, scraped, and rinsed again and again before it ever simmers, and that long, raw handling is exactly what worried the health authorities. The bacteria of concern is Yersinia, which lives in the hog's gut, and public health studies later traced cases of illness in young children to kitchens where raw chitlins were cleaned. The germs spread to counters, bottles, and pacifiers. Georgia public health researchers eventually found that boiling the chitlins for 5 minutes before cleaning killed the bacteria without changing the flavor. But in the 1960s, the warnings landed loud, and some cities pressed families to handle them with care or leave them be. The kitchens kept the New Year's pot going regardless. The alert named the danger, the tradition named the day. Number 14, Carolina Gold Middlings. Carolina Gold rice was the crop that built the Low Country. The grains that broke during pounding were not whole enough to sell. They were called middlings, the broken rice that the planter discarded and the kitchen kept. By 1820, every black household on the Sea Islands cooked middlings almost daily. They simmered like grits, swelled like risotto, took on the flavor of any broth. A bowl of middlings with shrimp and a stripe of butter was the breakfast of the rice fields, the river docks, the cotton gins, the railway stations. Number 24, tomato gravy. Across rural Alabama, the Carolinas, and most of Mississippi, breakfast meant biscuits, and biscuits meant gravy. But the gravy in the oldest church cookbooks was not the white sausage gravy sold in cans today. It was tomato gravy, bacon drippings, a spoon of flour, and home canned tomatoes from the summer garden, cooked thick and tangy in a skillet, then poured over split biscuits still warm from the oven. The color was dark red, almost brick. It stained the plate. Families who put up their own tomatoes ate this 4 mornings a week from August through March because the jars held in the pantry without refrigeration. Children who grew up eating it can still describe the exact color. When instant gravy powder arrived in the 1960s, tomato gravy quietly disappeared from most Southern tables before going any further. For those who want more of these old recipes, the dishes covered on this channel, and many that have not been, all collected in one place, Big Mama's Soul Food Kitchen, at my website, thehungryhistorian.com. It will not come up again in this video. If you want it, it is there. Now, number 24, chicken bog. This is a low country South Carolina dish that Black families along the PD River region made their own. Rice, chicken, smoked sausage, all cooked in one pot until the rice absorbed every drop of broth and went thick and sticky. The name comes from the texture. The rice bogs down. It was a church supper staple, cheap enough to feed 40 people from one pot. Families seasoned it differently depending on the county. Some added a splash of hot sauce at the end. Others kept it plain and let the smoked meat do the talking. Chicken bog never left the region, which is exactly why most of the country has never heard of it. The families who make it are not interested in sharing it with a food magazine. They are interested in making sure there's enough for seconds. Number 20, stewed tomatoes with okra and corn. The Gullah called these 3 crops the trinity of the August garden. A heavy pan went on the stove with bacon grease and chopped onion. The okra went in first and cooked down until the greens softened. Cut tomatoes followed, skins and all, with their juice. Last came corn cut fresh off the cob with the back of a knife, so the milky liquid dropped into the pot. It simmered for 30 minutes, salted at the end. A family of 8 could eat off it for 2 days, like a pot that refused to empty. The dish was vegetarian by accident, not principle. There was no meat that week. A bowl of it over rice was a complete meal. The okra thickened the broth. The corn added sweetness. The tomato cut everything with acid. 3 things from your yard, 1 pot. Number 12, purple hull peas. Purple hull peas stained everything they touched. Fingers, towels, the rim of the pot, the front of the apron. But they were among the most reliable crops in the Black Southern garden during the Depression. The peas were shelled by hand and cooked with a piece of smoked pork and enough water to make a thick broth. They came out soft, earthy, and slightly sweet, with a flavor deeper than black-eyed peas. The purple hull variety thrived in the poorest soil and the hottest weather, perfect for the clay-heavy ground across Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia. Served in large bowls with cornbread on the side, the pot liquor was considered the best part. Families who could not afford meat all week ate purple hull peas on Sunday and called it enough. Number 15, smothered chicken and gravy. Long before fried chicken became the face of soul food, the smothered version did the quiet, heavy lifting on a weeknight. Big Mama browned the pieces in the heavy pan, drowned them in a slow onion gravy, and set the lid on tight so the steam did the rest. An hour later, the meat slid off the bone and the gravy had thickened into something you wanted to sop with every crumb of bread. The dish asked for patience, not money, which is why it carried a family through the lean middle of the week. Then the deep fryer made chicken fast and patience went out of fashion. A bird cooked slow under a lid lost out to a bird cooked loud in oil. Number 25, buttermilk ice cream. This was never meant to be fancy. Leftover buttermilk from the morning biscuits, sugar, a little vanilla if the bottle had any left, and whatever cream could be spared. The tang of that buttermilk cut through the sweetness and left something sharp and clean on the tongue. It cost almost nothing to make. Grandmothers in Alabama and Mississippi churned this on weekday evenings when no occasion called for it, just because the buttermilk would turn if it sat another day. Nobody writes about it in cookbooks. It was too ordinary to be worth recording. That is exactly why it vanished. Number 10, fried apples with fatback. This was the breakfast of a porter about to work a 14-hour shift. Corrine cut 2 tart apples into thick wedges, skin and all. She fried 3 slices of fatback in a cast iron skillet until the edges went crisp, lifted them onto a plate, and dropped the apples straight into the pork drippings. A spoon of brown sugar on top. The apples softened, caramelized, and drank up the smoke. She served them beside the fatback with a hunk of biscuit. The whole plate cost under a dime, and it kept a grown man on his feet from dawn to dusk. Simple cooking, rich with history, the kind of breakfast that built the Pullman line. Frying in tallow and rendered fat was standard practice in African American kitchens long before seed oils dominated. Grocery shelves, beef tallow and pork lard were saved after cooking, strained, and reused for frying everything from chicken to cornbread. When industrial vegetable oils arrived, health campaigns labeled animal fats as heart disease culprits and promoted seed oils as healthier. But emerging research challenges that narrative, showing tallow is rich in fat, soluble vitamins, and has a more stable molecular structure at high heat than many seed oils. Polyunsaturated seed oils oxidize during frying, producing inflammatory compounds scientists now link to chronic health problems. The animal fats Black families cooked with turned out to be chemically safer for high heat cooking. Fried chicken wings with hot sauce drizzle appeared at juke joints and house parties long before buffalo wings became a national obsession. African American cooks fried whole wings until the skin turned glass crispy, then drizzled them with homemade hot sauce while still sizzling. This wasn't butter-based sauce, but pure pepper heat cut with vinegar and sugar. The wings were served in paper-lined baskets, eaten with fingers, and followed by cold drinks that cooled the burn. These wings were social food meant for passing around crowded tables where conversation flowed freely. The technique demanded attention to temperature and timing, wings needing enough time and oil to render fat beneath the skin. This style has been overshadowed by buffalo traditions, but it originated in southern kitchens where hot sauce was always within reach. Saturday mornings had their own rhythm, and beef and potato hash was the drumbeat. Somebody was already at the stove cubing cold leftover potatoes into a hot skillet with a little oil. Ground beef went in next, broken apart with a fork until it married with the potatoes. Onion, salt, pepper, a shake of seasoned salt from that red and yellow Lawry's container that never left the counter. You press the whole thing flat and let the bottom crust, that was the real secret, the crust, turn dark and crispy before flipping it in rough sections. Fried egg on top if you were lucky, hot sauce if you were smart. The dish stretched back through southern farmhouse breakfasts where nothing from the night before went to waste, and in a 1970s kitchen, that leftover pipeline was not thrift but art. That specific crunch of cast iron crust is something no restaurant has ever replicated because it required a pan seasoned by decades of meals cooked by someone who is no longer here to season anything at all. Turkey wings and gravy made ordinary weeknights feel like holidays, delivering the richness of Thanksgiving without the expense of a whole bird. The massive wings were seasoned generously with garlic, paprika and black pepper, then browned before being braised until the meat fell from the bone. The cooking liquid transformed into silky gravy enriched by rendered fat and collagen. Served over rice or alongside cornbread, this dish stretched a few pounds of turkey wings to feed a family of 6. The meat was tender and flavorful, carrying all the satisfaction of roasted turkey at a fraction of the price. Turkey wings were often overlooked at the butcher counter, making them affordable for families counting pennies. This dish proved that celebration did not require extravagance. Number 12, salt pork, the cut that got flagged for the very seasoning that made it sing. Salt pork is a slab of pork belly or side packed down in coarse salt until it cures hard and keeps for months without ice, and a small chunk of it could season a whole pot. Cooks dropped it into beans, simmered it with greens, and fried it crisp for breakfast, drawing flavor from the cheapest preserved meat on the shelf. It came straight down from slavery when a few pounds of salted pork and a peck of cornmeal were the weekly ration handed to enslaved families. By the 1960s, researchers were documenting that high blood pressure struck Black Americans harder and earlier, and the heavy sodium in cured staples like salt pork drew attention from the new public health focus on salt in the Southern table. Nutrition writers of the era urged families to lean less on salt-cured pork for seasoning. The cooks heard the message and reached for the salt pork all the same because it was the taste a pot was built on. Officials measured the sodium and the kitchen measured the flavor. Number 11, shrimp and grits. Stone ground white grits, cooked slow with water, a knob of butter, salt. While they cooked, the kitchen sautéed peeled creek shrimp with bacon, onion, and a hot pepper. The grits went into a deep bowl, the shrimp on top, the pan drippings poured over. This was the breakfast of the Gullah Geechee shrimping cruise from Edisto Island to the marshes of McClellanville. They left the dock at 4 a.m. and came home at noon with the catch. The dish was already on the table when they walked in. Corn from the planter, shrimp from the creek, cooking technique from the rice coast. 3 rivers met in one bowl. The Gullah women cooked it on iron stoves in plank kitchens with the windows wide open, the steam rolling out over the salt marsh. You may eat it now in a tablecloth restaurant in Charleston, but the recipe was clocked in on a fishing boat at 5 a.m. long before that. 17, watermelon rind preserves. The red flesh was eaten fresh. The rind was not thrown away. In old cookbooks from the Carolinas and Georgia, watermelon rind was peeled, cubed, soaked in lime water overnight to firm it up, then simmered for hours with sugar, lemon, and ginger until it turned translucent and sweet. The result was a clear, jewel-like preserve that tasted nothing like watermelon. Closer to candied ginger, delicate and strange, it kept in mason jars for a full year. Making it was an all-day job. The peeling alone took an hour, but it came from the part of the fruit that everyone else threw in the compost pile. In a kitchen where waste was not just frowned on, but genuinely could not be afforded, this preserve was an act of precision. Every part of the fruit had a purpose. Number 9, Lane cake, created by Emma Rylander. Lane of Clayton, Alabama, in the 1890s, this is a layered white cake filled with a cooked mixture of egg yolks, sugar, butter, raisins, pecans, and a generous pour of bourbon. Black women across Alabama and Georgia adopted it and made it a fixture of holiday baking, church homecomings, and family reunions. The filling was the secret. It ripened over a day or two, and the bourbon soaked into the cake layers until the whole thing tasted like something between a fruitcake and a celebration. Lane cake is labor intensive. The filling has to be stirred constantly over low heat. The layers have to be baked one at a time, and the whole assembly takes most of a day. That labor is the reason it is disappearing. But the women who made it never called it labor. They called it Saturday before homecoming. Number 9, oyster purlieu. Your oysters came out of the same creeks the Gula had been working since Reconstruction. From the 1880s until the 1950s, oyster harvesting was the main economy of Dolfuski Island, with 2,000 people working the beds at peak season. A pint of fresh shucked oysters with their liquor went into your hot pot of bacon fat and onion. The oysters cooked just long enough for the edges to curl, like leaves in fall. Long grain rice was added next, then water, then the oyster liquor itself for flavor. The pot covered, the heat low, the timer set for 18 minutes. When it came off your stove, the rice was tender, the oysters folded through, and the pot smelled of the marsh and the fire. Industrial pollution from Savannah closed the Dolfuski beds in the 1950s, and the oyster economy collapsed. The recipe survived. A spoon today still tastes of the creek that fed your island for 70 years. Number 16, fig preserves. Nearly every black homestead in the Deep South had a fig tree in the yard. Brown turkey figs, Celeste figs, whatever variety had been planted by a grandmother or a great-grandmother decades before. The fruit ripened in waves through the summer, soft and fragile, too delicate to ship anywhere. Church women cooked them down whole with sugar and a little lemon juice in heavy pots, stirring slowly until the syrup thickened and the figs turned translucent. The preserves were ladled into glass jars and sealed with paraffin wax. A single tree could produce enough fruit for 30 jars. They showed up at the church table spread on biscuits, spooned over pound cake, or eaten straight from the jar with a spoon. The fig tree asked for nothing. It just kept giving. Number 6, okra and tomatoes. The seed itself sailed across the ocean in the hands of the enslaved, hidden and guarded, because okra was West Africa refusing to be left behind. Big Mama stewed the green pods down with summer tomatoes, onion, and a little bacon grease until they melded into a soft soupy side that thickened on its own. It was the garden at the peak of August, captured in one pot. The dish was a direct line to the pepper pots and stews of the African coast, a memory cooked fresh every summer. As frozen vegetables flattened the seasons, the slow summer stew lost its moment. A pot of pure heritage became just another vegetable nobody waits all year to make. Number 20, blackberry ice cream. Wild blackberries, picked along fence rows and creek banks, strained through cheesecloth to catch the seeds, and stirred into a cream base that turned the color of a bruise. Picking those berries was a family job. Children came home with stained fingers and scratched arms. The ice cream was the reward. Deep South families made this in June and July when the berries came in so heavy they could not eat them all fresh. When those fence rows got bulldozed for subdivisions, the berry patches went with them. Before the rest of the house stirred, there was tomato gravy simmering on the back burner, and you could smell the bacon fat cutting through the sharpness of canned tomatoes from under your blanket. The dish needed nothing expensive, just drippings saved in the coffee can by the stove, a tablespoon of flour stirred until it browned, and a can of stewed tomatoes crushed by hand into the skillet. A pinch of sugar took the acid down. The gravy was poured thick over white rice and eaten with a spoon, sometimes alongside fried eggs or salt pork. It came from Depression-era black kitchens where one can of tomatoes fed a household of 8, and it traveled north to Detroit and Chicago inside the memories of women who never stopped cooking it. Through the 70s, it held on as a weekday standard, the kind nobody wrote down. You made it the way your mother showed you, and if you asked for measurements, She would shake her head and say, "Pour until it looks right." By September, the overflow went into jars and came back out in January when the garden was frozen solid. The knowledge of how long to cook it, how much heat, it lives nowhere written down. Eating wild game like rabbit and squirrel was a regular practice in African American households, especially in rural communities where hunting supplemented limited food budgets. As commercial meat expanded, wild game was dismissed as unsanitary and inferior to store-bought beef. Health officials warned about parasites carried by wild animals, but modern analysis tells a different story. Wild rabbit and squirrel meat is leaner, higher in protein, and richer in omega-3 fatty acids than commercially raised livestock. These animals foraged on natural diets, free from antibiotics and growth hormones, producing meat scientists now consider superior in nutritional profile. Families who hunted and prepared wild game were eating cleaner protein than most grocery stores offer today. Buttermilk fried chicken was the secret weapon of African American cooks who understood that tangy dairy transformed tough birds into tender perfection. The chicken soaked overnight in buttermilk mixed with hot sauce and salt, the acid breaking down muscle fibers while infusing flavor deep into the meat. By morning, the chicken had become impossibly tender, ready for dredging in seasoned flour that clung like armor. The marriage of tangy buttermilk and crispy flour created a crust that shattered audibly and meat so juicy it seemed impossible. This wasn't a shortcut, but an investment. Planning Sunday's dinner on Saturday night, families passed down their exact buttermilk ratios, some adding pickle juice to intensify the effect. Modern quick marinating methods have replaced overnight soaking, but the depth of flavor remains unmatched. Salisbury steak carried a quiet dignity in a household where ground beef was the only cut you could afford. You mixed the meat with breadcrumbs, a beaten egg, minced onion, and a splash of Worcestershire sauce, then shaped it into thick ovals that looked, if you squinted, like something closer to a real steak. Browned in a skillet until a dark crust formed, set aside while you made the gravy in the same pan. Canned mushrooms, a little butter, flour stirred into the drippings, broth poured slow until the sauce went thick and brown. The patties simmered in it and came to the table over mashed potatoes or egg noodles. Swanson had been selling Salisbury steak in TV dinner trays since the 1950s, but the homemade version was something else entirely. Every mother who made it was taking the cheapest meat in the store and turning it into something that felt earned. The children who ate it never knew the cost until they grew up and tried to make it for their own families, standing alone in a kitchen that used to be full. Fried catfish with hot water cornbread was a pairing so perfect it defined Southern black cooking. The catfish fillets were soaked in buttermilk, dredged in seasoned cornmeal, and fried until the coating crackled with each bite, while the flesh inside stayed moist and sweet. Hot water cornbread was made by pouring boiling water over cornmeal, forming the dough into small patties, and frying them until crisp outside and tender within. Together they created a meal of textures and flavors that satisfied on the deepest level. In the 1970s, fish fries brought entire communities together on Friday nights and summer weekends. The catfish came from local rivers and ponds, caught by fathers and grandfathers who passed down fishing knowledge along with recipes. This pairing represented abundance pulled directly from southern waters. Number 25, fried fatback. Long before anybody called it a heart wrist, this was the slab that held a Sunday breakfast together. Fatback is the firm layer of pork fat off the hog's back, sliced thin, dredged in cornmeal, and crisped in its own grease until the edges curled like brittle. Our grandmothers kept it because it was cheap and it stretched. a leftover cut handed down from slavery days when the meaty parts went to the big house. By the early 1960s, after Ansel Keys landed on the cover of Time in 1961 and the American Heart Association issued its first warning about saturated fat, that crackling slab became one of the foods the new Fat and Heart message singled out. Some county nutrition pamphlets told families to render less and fry less. Folks went right on doing it anyway because fatback was flavor and survival in one pan. Health officials warned against the grease, but the table remembered the taste. Number 22, Benny wafers. Sesame seeds toasted in a dry skillet until the air smelled like burnt nuts. Brown sugar, butter, flour, a pinch of salt. The dough dropped by half teaspoons onto buttered tin sheets, baked thin and crisp until the edges browned. The word bene is wolof. The seeds came across in the seams of garments, in the hair braids of Mande women, in hollow gourds tucked under the false bottoms of slave ship cargo. They were planted in the kitchen garden, plots that enslaved cooks were allowed on the rice plantations. By 1850, every Charleston tea table held a 10 of them, and the same 10 showed up on a black church table at coffee hour the same week. Your grandmother might have called them lucky cookies. She wasn't wrong. The wafers were thought to bring good fortune, a belief that walked the same route the seeds did. Each crisp bite is a Wolof phrase you've forgotten how to spell. 22, leather breeches. Every fall across Appalachia and the Upper South, green beans were threaded onto long strings with a needle and hung from porch rafters or kitchen ceiling beams to dry in the air. They hung there for weeks, shriveling into tough, leathery strips that looked like nothing you would want to eat. The cookbooks called them leather breeches. When winter came, the dried beans were pulled down, soaked overnight, and simmered low with a ham hock or a piece of smoked side meat. After hours in the pot, they softened into something rich and deep with a concentrated flavor that fresh green beans could never match. The method came through the Caribbean and into the American South. Dehydration was preservation before refrigeration existed. The strings came down for good when chest freezers arrived. Number 16, fried okra, sliced into rounds, tossed in seasoned cornmeal, and fried in a cast iron skillet with enough oil to come halfway up the pieces. The outside turned golden and crunchy, while the inside stayed tender without the sliminess that made boiled okra divisive. Black families across every corner of the South fried okra from June through September when the pods were small and fresh from the garden. The key was cutting them thick enough to hold their shape and getting the oil hot enough that the cornmeal sealed immediately. Too cool and the coating fell off. Too thin and they burned before the okra cooked through. A good batch disappeared from the plate before dinner was served, picked at by every hand that passed through the kitchen. It was a side dish in theory and a snack in practice, and nobody ever made enough. Number 17, field pea soup with smoked hocks. The pea was the Sea Island red pea, a small dark legume Gula families had been growing in side yard plots for 200 years. A cup of dried peas was rinsed, picked over for stones, and dropped into a pot with the smoked ham hock from the previous winter's hog. Onion, garlic, a sprig of thyme, water. It cooked for 3 hours like a slow clock. The hock fell apart, the peas softened into a thick brown porridge, and the broth turned almost meaty. A bowl with rice and cornbread fed your working man for the whole afternoon. The Sea Island red pea nearly went extinct in the 20th century when commercial farms switched to the cheaper black-eyed pea. Today, it's grown again by a handful of low-country farmers. The grandmothers never stopped saving the seeds. They knew what they had. Number 21, tea cakes. Before store-bought cookies existed in most Black communities, there were tea cakes, large, flat, round, barely sweet, flavored with vanilla and a little nutmeg. The dough was rolled out on a floured table and cut with the rim of a drinking glass. Church mothers baked them by the dozens for Sunday school, funerals, and revivals. The recipe required flour, sugar, butter or lard, eggs, and buttermilk. Children waited at the kitchen door while the first batch cooled on a piece of brown paper. A batch of tea cakes could be made for pennies and lasted an entire week, stored in a tin can with a tight lid. The flavor was plain by modern standards, but the smell of them baking was the smell of somebody's house on a Saturday afternoon. Number 11, salmon croquettes. This is the dish that came north during the Great Migration and quietly disappeared in a city apartment, and its whole story lives in a humble can. When New Deal subsidies dropped canned salmon to a few pennies a tin, Black families packing up for Chicago and Detroit and Harlem carried the recipe with them like a piece of home. Big Mama flaked the fish into a bowl, bound it with egg, cornmeal, and a little onion, then patted out cakes and fried them golden for a Saturday breakfast. It let a family eat something that tasted of the southern fish fry without a river anywhere in sight. For a while, it was the smell that said the family had made it through another week. Then frozen dinners took over the city morning. A dish that crossed half a country to follow its people went silent in the rooms it landed in. Number 23, molasses ice cream. Dark molasses, not the light kind, stirred into a cooked custard until the whole batch turned the color of wet clay. It had a bitterness underneath the sweet that children either loved or refused. This was a winter ice cream in houses where sugar was expensive and molasses came by the gallon from the general store. By the 1970s, when refined sugar cost less than $1 a bag, nobody reached for the molasses jug anymore. The flavor disappeared with the economics that made it necessary. Number 6, shortening bread. The word shortening was Southern shorthand for shortening, meaning lard. Corinne's version was 3 cups of flour, 1 cup of lard, half a cup of sugar, and a pinch of salt. No liquid. Her fingers did the work, crumbling the lard into the flour until the whole bowl looked like wet sand. She pressed the dough into a greased skillet, cut it into squares, and baked it in a neighbor's oven for 20 minutes. It came out rich, crumbly, almost cookie-like. Children loved it. Old men dunked it in coffee. A whole pan cost maybe 12 cents and disappeared before it cooled. The old song about mama's little baby loves, shortening bread, was not fiction. It was a kitchen in Alabama, a kitchen in Georgia, a kitchen on Sugar Hill, all baking the same thing. Poke salad greens were a springtime tradition in African-American households across the rural South, gathered wild from fields when fresh vegetables were scarce. Health officials warned against eating pokeweed for decades, calling it toxic. And they were partly right. Raw pokeweed contains compounds that cause illness. But Black families already knew that, which is why the greens were always boiled in multiple changes of water before being sauteed with onions and fatback. This process removed the harmful toxins while preserving impressive nutrition. Scientists now confirm that properly prepared poke salad is rich in vitamins A and C, iron, and antioxidants that rival cultivated greens. The knowledge of safe preparation was passed through generations of women who understood botany through practice. Cold fried chicken was picnic perfection, intentionally made hours ahead and served at room temperature when flavors had settled and the crust had firmed. African American families understood that fried chicken actually improved when allowed to rest, the seasoning permeating deeper while the coating lost its greasy sheen. The chicken was fried the night before, cooled on wire racks, then packed into baskets lined with wax paper or clean napkins. Juneteenth celebrations, family reunions, and cemetery decoration days featured cold fried chicken as the centerpiece, eaten with fingers on quilts spread over grass. The crust at room temperature had different texture entirely, more substantial and almost crumbly, while the meat remained moist. This was intentional cooking, not leftovers, prepared specifically to be eaten cold. Hamburger steak with onion gravy hit the table more nights than most people want to admit, not because it was boring, but because it worked. You took a pound of ground beef, maybe 59 cents at the A&P in 1970, mixed it with salt, black pepper, a little garlic powder, and shaped thick oval patties with your hands. No egg, no breadcrumbs in the old school version. You seared those patties in a cast iron skillet until the crust turned almost black, then pulled them out and dropped sliced onions into that hot grease. The onions went soft and golden while you stirred in flour, scraping up every bit of foam stuck to the bottom. Water or broth went in next, whisked smooth, and the patties came back to simmer until the gravy thickened and the whole kitchen smelled like someone's mama was home. Served over white rice with canned green beans, it fed 5 people for under $2. Your grandmother never measured the flour. She just knew, and nobody who came after her has ever gotten that gravy quite right. Oxtail stew with butter beans was Sunday dinner royalty, a dish that required time and attention, but rewarded with flavors that seemed to echo through generations. Oxtails were seared until caramelized, then braised slowly with tomatoes, onions, garlic, thyme, and allspice until the meat surrendered from the bone. Butter beans were added in the final hour, absorbing the rich gravy while holding their shape. The marrow from the bones melted into the sauce, creating natural richness that no store-bought product could replicate. Served over rice or with crusty bread, this stew was reserved for occasions that mattered. Those who mastered oxtail stew earned reputations that spread through churches and neighborhoods, their pots requested at every gathering. Number 18, country ham. Salt was the whole reason this ham survived a southern summer without a refrigerator, and salt was exactly why officials grew nervous about it. Country ham is cured deep in salt, then hung and aged for months until it is firm, dark, and intensely savory, sliced thin and fried with red-eye gravy made from the drippings and a splash of coffee. The method came out of necessity, a way to keep meat through the year on land where ice was scarce. By the 1960s, researchers were already documenting that high blood pressure hit Black Americans harder and earlier, and the sodium in heavily cured meats like country ham drew attention from the new public health focus on salt. Health messaging of the era began urging families to ease up on the saltiest cuts. The ham still hung in the smokehouse and the skillet still spat what the doctors called sodium, the kitchen called keeping the meat alive. Number 18, smothered okra. A cast iron skillet on low heat, a strip of bacon, sliced okra, diced tomato, onion, cover the pan, walk away for 40 minutes. The pods break down into a thick gravy, and the slime that scares modern cooks becomes the binder that holds the dish together. Smothered cooking came in the bilges with the same people who carried the rice, a long, low simmer in a closed pot like a slow conversation, minimal water, maximum patience. Charleston cooks on Trad Street were doing it in 1810 in copper pans, and Beaufort cooks were doing it in iron pots set on coals. Same technique, same okra, same hour on the clock. The bacon goes in first, the okra at the middle, the salt at the end. You can do it tonight on your own range, and you're standing in line behind 200 years of women who never measured anything. Number 18, pepper vinegar. On nearly every table in the rural Black South, next to the salt shaker, sat a glass bottle filled with hot peppers and white vinegar. It showed up in community cookbooks, not as a recipe, but as a given, the way flour might appear. You packed small hot peppers into a bottle, covered them with vinegar, and let it sit on the counter for a week. The vinegar turned amber, then orange. A few drops went on collard greens, black-eyed peas, turnip greens, and anything else that needed heat. Nobody bought hot sauce when the pepper bottle was already there. When you ran low, you just added more vinegar and let it sit another few days. The bottle was never empty and never finished. When Tabasco and Louisiana brand hot sauce became cheap and everywhere in the 1970s, the homemade bottle slowly disappeared from the table. Number 20, fried squash, yellow crookneck squash, sliced thin, dredged in cornmeal, and fried in a cast iron skillet until the edges turned golden and the center stayed soft. This was a summer garden staple in Black households across the Deep South. Every family grew squash because it produced more than anyone could eat. Frying it in cornmeal was the fastest way to serve it, and children who refused boiled vegetables would eat fried squash without complaint. A little salt, maybe a dusting of black pepper, and it came out of the pan onto a plate lined with a paper bag to catch the grease. Simple. It did not pretend to be anything other than what it was. A garden vegetable, fried right, eaten hot, gone from most tables by the time frozen vegetables took over, but still alive in the kitchens that never trusted a freezer more than a garden. Number 23, hominy grits with red eye gravy. The grits were stone ground at a small mill near Frogmore in 1955, coarse enough you could see each broken kernel. They cooked low for 45 minutes, finished with butter and salt. The gravy was the secret. A slice of country ham went into a hot skillet. The fat rendered, the meat browned, and the cook poured a small cup of black coffee straight into the pan like a dare. The drippings lifted, the coffee reduced, and what was left was a thin, dark sauce poured over the grits and ham. The contrast between the soft cream of the grits and the sharp brown coffee was the whole point. A retired oysterman on Edisto could eat the same breakfast every morning for 40 years. He didn't complain once. Number 25, cat head biscuits. They got the name because they were the size of a cat's head, and in Depression-era Black churches, that size was the point. A single biscuit could fill a child for most of a Sunday. The recipe called for nothing more than flour, lard, buttermilk, and a pinch of salt. No rolling pin. The dough was patted out by hand on a floured board, torn into rounds, and pressed flat with a palm. They came out of a wood-fired oven with a golden crust that cracked when pulled apart, and a soft, steaming center that held butter like a sponge. Every church mother had her own ratio, and none of them measured a thing. The biscuit was the foundation of the entire church table. Everything else was built around it. Number 30, cornbread and buttermilk. This was the supper she made when there was no supper, and nobody ever complained. She crumbled day-old cornbread into a tall glass, poured cold buttermilk over the top, and let it sit until the bread went soft and tangy. Some folks ate it with a spoon-like soup. Others tipped the glass back and drank it down on the porch after a long day in the heat. For families stretching one skillet across a week, this was both the last meal of the day and the start of the next. Then commercial dairy changed, palates changed, and a generation decided buttermilk belonged in a recipe, not in a glass. A dish that fed millions quietly slipped out the back door of the kitchen. Number 12, cane syrup ice cream. In sugarcane country, Louisiana, and parts of East Texas and coastal Georgia, families had access to fresh-pressed cane syrup from local mills. They used it the way others use sugar, pouring it directly into the cream base and letting the mineral sweetness of raw cane do the work. This ice cream had a depth that white sugar could never reach. It tasted like the earth it grew in. When the small mills shut down and cane syrup became a specialty item on a grocery shelf, the recipe lost its reason for existing. Number 24, hot water cornbread. This was the bread of no oven. Corinne's kitchenette had a 2-burner gas ring and nothing else. So she made bread in a cast iron skillet on the stovetop. Yellow cornmeal, a pinch of salt, and boiling water poured straight over the meal until it tightened into a soft dough. She shaped it into small patties with wet hands and fried them in bacon drippings saved from the morning. The outside turned crackling brown. The inside stayed soft as pudding. 3 cents worth of meal fed 5 people. Her grandmother taught her the water had to be rolling hot or the patties would fall apart in the grease. That detail had traveled up from the Carolinas with every cook who boarded the train north. Now here is what most people miss. Hot water cornbread was not a recipe. It was a solution. No oven, no milk, no eggs, no problem. Cooking in unlined cast iron pots was the standard in African American kitchens for generations, with heavy skillets and Dutch ovens passed down like heirlooms. When nonstick coatings and aluminum pans arrived, cast iron was labeled old-fashioned. Health officials raised concerns about iron leaching into food, but scientists discovered that cooking in cast iron provides beneficial dietary iron, particularly important for populations at risk of anemia. The seasoned surface from years of cooking with animal fats formed a natural nonstick coating far safer than synthetic chemicals in modern pans. Recent studies linked chemicals in nonstick coatings to serious health concerns, making grandmother's trusted cast iron look smarter with every passing year. Smothered fried chicken was Sunday dinner royalty in African American households, combining 2 beloved techniques into one unforgettable dish. The chicken was seasoned with salt, pepper, and paprika, dredged in flour, and fried golden until the crust crackled. The magic happened next when sliced onions softened in the drippings, and rich gravy was built from flour and broth. The fried pieces returned to the skillet covered, simmering until fork tender, the gravy soaking into every crevice of that crispy coating. Families served it over rice or alongside biscuits that soaked up every drop of savory liquid gold. The dish represented patience and love, transforming simple fried chicken into something that made guests push back from the table satisfied. Though smothered chicken appears occasionally, this technique has largely faded. Smothered cabbage with ground beef was the kind of meal you did not brag about at school, but you ate 2 plates of at home. A head of cabbage cost a dime in 1971, and shredded into a skillet with browned beef, onion, and a splash of vinegar, it became something far bigger than its price. The cabbage wilted down slow, absorbing fat from the meat until every ribbon was soft, faintly sweet, and edged with tang. Seasoned with garlic powder, paprika, and a pinch of sugar to cut the acid, this dish descended from cooks who understood that cabbage and pork fat had been partners since the plantation garden. 1 skillet, a head of cabbage, a half pound of beef, enough for 6. The receipt looked like nothing. The plate looked like everything, and the kitchen carried the smell for hours after the stove went cold. Chicken gizzard stew turned an often discarded organ into something families genuinely looked forward to eating. Gizzards were cheap at the butcher counter, sold by the pound for far less than other chicken parts. They required long cooking to become tender, but that time transformed their chewy texture into something almost silky. The gizzards were browned first, then simmered with onions, garlic, tomatoes, and potatoes until everything melded together. Some cooks added carrots or celery, while others kept it simple with salt, pepper, and bay leaves. The gravy that formed was dark and rich, perfect for ladling over rice or biscuits. Children who grew up eating this stew developed a taste for organ meats early. The dish represented kitchen wisdom, knowledge that parts others threw away could become dinner. Number 21, hog maws. Few dishes test a cook's patience and a kitchen's cleanliness like the stomach of a hog. Hog maws are exactly that. The pig's stomach lining scraped and turned and scrubbed for hours before they ever hit the pot, often simmered right alongside chitterlings for a New Year's feast. They came down the same road as every other offcut handed to enslaved people because the owners would not eat them, then made into something prized through sheer skill. Because the cleaning was so long and so messy, public health officers grouped maws with the other raw pork innards that drove their 1960s urban sanitation drives, warning that careless handling could spread illness around the kitchen. Inspectors leaned on markets and home cooks alike to be cautious with raw hog parts and to scrub down every surface afterward. None of that kept the maws out of the holiday pot, where they simmered soft and savory beside the chitlins for hours. What the city called a hazard, the family called tradition. Number 25, Carolina red rice. The smell of tomato paste hitting bacon fat in a heavy black pot, onion turning translucent, long grain rice stirred through the orange slick until every kernel wore a coat of color. A Charleston cook would simmer it covered for 40 minutes, never lift the lid, never stir. What was lost? The red palm oil that would have stained a bowl of jollof in Senegambia. What was preserved? The ratio, the one pot, the silence of the cooking. The word jollof comes from the Wolof Empire of the 14th century. The dish that crossed in 1730 traded palm for pork fat and kept everything else. Sunday plates in Mount Pleasant still hold the same rice your great-great-grandmother set down on a plank table. The recipe outlived the road that brought it. Buttermilk pie. The recipe called for 6 ingredients: flour, sugar, eggs, butter, buttermilk, and a pinch of nutmeg. That was it. No fruit, no chocolate, no cream, just the things already sitting in a farmhouse kitchen on any given day. Buttermilk pie appeared in handwritten cookbooks from Black communities across the South starting in the late 1800s. The filling was a simple custard poured into a homemade crust and baked until it set. The top browned and cracked slightly. The inside stayed smooth and tangy and sweet. What made buttermilk pie important was not its flavor, it was what the pie represented. When the pantry was bare, when the money had run out and the garden was frozen, and the hog had been eaten down to the bones, a woman could still make this. Buttermilk was the liquid left over from churning butter. Sugar was bought in bulk at the start of the year. Flour was always there. Eggs came from the yard. Every ingredient was already paid for or already present. The pie was proof that something could still come out of the oven when everything else was gone. It was not decorated. It sat on the counter on a Tuesday afternoon in February when nobody was coming over, and it meant that the kitchen was still working. Church cookbooks in Alabama and Mississippi printed the recipe so often that some collections had 3 or 4 versions, each submitted by a different woman, each nearly identical. Today, buttermilk pie survives in a few bakeries and farmhouse restaurants across the South. Most people under 50 have never heard of it. Number 6. Number 23, sawmill gravy. White gravy made from pan drippings, flour, and milk, poured over biscuits and eaten for breakfast, lunch, or dinner, depending on how tight the week was. The name came from the lumber camps where workers ate it because it was cheap and filling. In black households across the rural South, sawmill gravy stretched a small amount of sausage or salt pork into a meal for an entire table. The technique was simple but unforgiving. Too much flour and it turned to paste. Not enough fat and it stuck to the skillet. The cook had to stand there stirring the whole time, adjusting the milk by feel until the consistency was right. Nobody wrote that part down. By the time younger generations asked how to make it, the women who knew the feel of it were already gone. Number 25, Dofusky deviled crab. The blue crabs came up out of the creek at dawn. Sally Ann Robinson learned to pick one clean before she could read. The meat went into a porcelain bowl with crushed saltines, one beaten egg, a pinch of dry mustard, and a hard shake of black pepper. The mixture went back into the clean shell of the crab itself, like a small boat carrying its own cargo. That was the plate, that was the serving dish. Each shell went under the broiler until the top blistered. A family of 9 could eat off 12 crabs and a sleeve of crackers. The shells were rinsed and stored on a shelf for next time. On Dofusky in 1962, the nearest grocery store was a 40-minute boat ride away. The crab paid for itself. Number 13, yeast rolls. Yeast rolls at a black church supper were a luxury and everyone knew it. Yeast cost money. The dough took time. A woman had to start early in the morning mixing flour, sugar, warm milk, butter, and yeast into a soft dough that she kneaded until it was smooth and elastic. Then she waited for it to rise. Then she punched it down, shaped it into small rounds, set them in a grease pan, and waited again. They came out of the oven, tall, golden, and impossibly light. The smell filled the fellowship hall before anyone saw the basket. Yeast rolls meant somebody had invested time and ingredients that could have gone elsewhere. They were an offering, not a side dish. The woman who brought yeast rolls had given her morning to the church. Number 17, fried catfish and spaghetti. Here's the one that fed an entire church basement on a Sunday and was never written down even once. Down south, the fish fry and the spaghetti pot came together into a plate that confuses outsiders and comforts everybody raised on it. Big Mama dredged the catfish in seasoned cornmeal and fried it crisp, then ladled a long simmered tomato gravy over a mound of spaghetti beside it. The whole thing was built to multiply, to stretch from a family of 6 to a hall of 60 when the deacons announced the supper. And that handwritten card on the cabinet door said only fish and spaghetti. No amounts and no times, because the rest lived in her hands and her ear. A dish that fed the most people, left behind the fewest instructions. Number 22, pecan praline ice cream. Not the store version with candy chunks. The original used homemade praline syrup cooked down in a cast iron pot until it smoked, then poured in a thin stream into the churning cream. The pecans were gathered from the yard, cracked on the porch, and toasted in the oven until they smelled like the whole fall condensed into one afternoon. Louisiana grandmothers guarded this method. The praline syrup had to hit the cream at exactly the right temperature, or it seized into hard candy. Every single one of these dishes carried something bigger than flavor. They carried memory, survival, family, and pride in a tradition that was built from scratch with almost nothing. If one of these recipes brought back someone you miss, share this video with the person who needs to hear it. And if you have not already, subscribe so you never miss another trip back to the kitchen that raised you.